Hello everyone, this is Jim of Shiloh Hall. For 30 plus years of my adult life, I embraced, followed, trusted church teaching and leading their doctrines that ideally were born out of Scripture and understanding of Scripture. But for the past better than a half decade now, I've been doing my own deep dive studies into Scriptures, and I'm finding many errant issues in church doctrine and church leading and church guidance. One of those issues is this idea of the first day of the week and the various doctrines that are born out of that phrase. Turns out that phrase occurs 8 times in all of Scripture, all in the new writings, never in the old writings that I can find. And it turns out that the Greek that has been being translated into the first day of the week, well, I can't read the Greek, but I can try to sound out the transliterated Greek. And the transliterated Greek upon which they are translating first day of the week is T, Miaton, Sabbaton. The literal one-for-one word translation of that into English is on one of the Sabbaths. And on one of the Sabbaths is vastly different than the first day of the week, because it was clear that the Sabbath was the 7th day of the week and not the first day of the week. And that has impact upon doctrine. From that phrase, first day of the week, we're getting the teaching that Messiah rose on Sunday, the first day of the week, which gives us the concept of the Lord's Day and is the basis for why we're meeting on Sunday, that first day of the week, or the Lord's Day, instead of the historic and traditional Sabbath day command, which was the 7th day where we were to rest and gather. So upon discovering that the first day of the week, foundational to church doctrine, was actually being translated from T, Miaton, Sabbaton, that set me off into some study and in the production of a video that I produced and put out in August of 2024. Recently, January of 2026, I had the privilege of someone who appears to be a Greek scholar watching and evaluating my video and then providing some very significant and what I deem to be very important information and feedback on the very concept of T, Miaton, Sabbaton. And that's what this video is all about, sharing the information he provides in support of the first day of the week as the proper translation for T, Miaton, Sabbaton, and the opportunity to test that and see what he says against what I can find, testing it against T, Miaton, Sabbaton, literally being translated on one of the Sabbaths. Okay, before I get started with the exchange that I had with this gentleman, I do want to express my appreciation to him. His name is Ken. I will refer to him as Ken. I appreciate his analysis, the time that he spent with my videos, and then the time he spent with me in an exchange of questions and comments. And I would like to say that I appreciate his position. I have learned to vastly more appreciate the Greek scholarship that went into translating and the reasons why it went into translating into T, Miaton, Sabbaton into the first day of the week. So as we go through this video, and I will be challenging, I will be testing everything he says, and some of what he said might have, he would have said quickly. And so maybe if he had opportunity to actually speak to me and clarify what he was saying, so maybe he would have expressed it differently or clarified some things that he wrote that I will be testing. So I guess what I'm really saying is that I want to be fair to him, that this may not, in how I interpret everything he wrote, and where he would clarify what he wrote to be more specific in what he meant. All these things are possible, and the point of that is that I want to be fair to him. I do not want to be disrespectful. Never throughout this video do I want to disparage or disrespect Ken. I very much appreciate his work, appreciate him as a Greek scholar and someone who is vastly more knowledgeable than I can ever be in the Greek language. So with that, let's get started though. So Ken wrote this after watching my video from August of 24. Let me go show you what that video is. So this is the video that Ken watched. I entitled it Mia Tone Sabbaton, or Mia Ton Sabbaton, the way I wrote it, and first day of the week or on one of the Sabbaths, and this goes back to August 25 of 2024. This is the video he watched, and it is a 40-minute video, so he invested some time in that. And in response to that video, he wrote this. In Acts chapter 20, verse 7, we read, and then this is the Greek, and this is the transliterated Greek, ti mia ton sabbaton, where we've added punctuation for the actual, where I titled my video Mia ton sabbaton. Well, that sabbaton would be the singular form of this Sabbath, and whereas this sabbaton is the plural form. But the literal phraseology is in the transliterated Greek is ti mia ton sabbaton, where mia is the dative feminine form of heis, and sabbaton is the genitive plural form of the neuter noun sabbaton. So here is the singular the singular form of the noun Sabbath, and mia is the dative feminine form of the Greek word for one, which is heis. Now heis is in the masculine form, mia is in the feminine form. And this is important because he's saying Greek adjectives, which cardinal numbers are, which is mia, always match the word they modify in gender. Because mia is feminine, it cannot modify a neuter noun like sabbaton, rendering your interpretation literally impossible. Well, prior to this, I did not, maybe I should have known that there were different genders of Greek words and grammar that has to be brought into consideration of the subject matter of mia ton sabbaton. It needs to be understood, and that to present ti mia ton sabbaton as meaning one of the Sabbath days, or one of the Sabbaths, you have to take into account the Greek grammar, because it cannot, as it's written, be correct grammar. And that's news to me. That was news to me. Thank you, Ken. Okay. But then he goes on to say, it renders my interpretation literally impossible. I'm going to have to think that he means by my interpretation meaning on one of the Sabbaths, because that's the literal word for word translation. So I'm not sure it's my interpretation more so than it's just literally the one-for-one words of on one of the Sabbaths and then taking that literally, which I think he's saying is impossible. You can't take it literally to mean one for one on one of the Sabbaths. Then he goes on to say, for your interpretation to be accurate, we would need to have, and then he gave me the Greek here. He did not transliterate it, but he gave me the Greek in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, or more likely, he gave me another Greek word here. Okay, so let me just comment to this, but I'm not going to build upon it here because he addresses it again later. I will say that what he did here and what he's suggesting is this becomes tu hini ton. It might actually be, it's either tu or ti, hini ton sabbaton. And what he's done here is he's left Sabbath plural, left tone in place, but he's replaced mia, which is the feminine form of the Greek word for one, and replaced it with hini, which is the neuter form of the Greek word for one. So hini and mia and heis all mean one, just in different genders. So he has corrected the case, or the gender. He's added a neuter adjective to go along with a neuter noun. And then he says, or more likely, and then it becomes tu evi hini tu sabbatu. And in this case, he's taken Sabbath and turned it into the singular sabbatu. Okay. Well, he doesn't really develop that here. He just makes the statement, but it begs for more explanation, because one of the immediate questions is, okay, well, why didn't they do that? What would be the purpose? Why did they not? If it could be done, and you could have had ti hini ton sabbaton, and nobody would have questioned it, why didn't it happen? Questions come up, and later he answers it. But he seems to change his direction here, where he says, instead a feminine noun, which day is, must be inserted, and such insertions are often required in Greek. Well, that's where he left it. And this explains why we see in the King James, let me go there very quickly. So this explains why we will see in various translations the insertion of day here that we see, and this is the King James Version, the insertion of day, and then they italicize it to let us know, italicize it to let us know that they've inserted this day. Well, I know initially we're all wondering, well, why do you think it's okay to insert day in there? Well, it turns out it's because the Greek requires the insertion of day, apparently, according to Ken. Okay, so he introduces this, which later we will understand to be ellipsis, but here he just throws it out. Okay, so in response to his initial comment, I wrote up and then made a video, and I do need to read this to you so that you will understand the basis from which he makes another comment in reply to this. So this is my reply to Ken. Thank you. I very much appreciate your comments. They sent me off to evaluate and contemplate, and I'm grateful. While I do not know the Greek language and cannot embark on learning it fully, you've given me more information with which to become familiar and versant, and I hope that I have successfully understood your comments and intent. The Greek adjectives and nouns must match gender. That Greek adjectives and nouns must match gender is familiar of ear, but admittedly not something I'd given consideration. Here are some thoughts and questions. You advise that the feminine adjective mia cannot modify the neuter noun Sabbaton. Nevertheless, that's exactly what we do see, mia modifying Sabbaton. And what I mean by that is in the phrase ti mia ton Sabbaton, literally what the author penned is a feminine adjective modifying a neuter noun with no other words added, expressly added. That's what I was saying. When you say your interpretation, I assume you refer to my assertion that mia ton Sabbaton should be rendered as one of the Sabbaths, and you are stating that isn't possible and offer instead what makes it possible, which is to change the gender of the adjective to neuter, hen or heni, to align with the neuter noun Sabbaton. When you later say a feminine noun, such as day, must be inserted, it seems reasonable to infer you support the typical English rendering of first day of the week. So I further infer from what you've written that you acknowledge one of two things fixes the problem. Either change the gender of the adjective to neuter or add a feminine noun somewhere for the feminine mia to modify. Either solution has some merit in my estimation, so long as you can retain the apparent intent and meaning of the author. The phrasing you provided works well. To that I think I would have meant to heni ton Sabbaton. That works well, seems to work for me. And then to add the word day gets a little more challenging, but coming up with something like one of the Sabbath days also seems reasonable. But neither of these solutions are what is written in the text. What we have is mia modifying Sabbaton. Again, in clarification, they literally wrote ti mia ton Sabbaton with a feminine adjective modifying a neuter noun. That's what they wrote. To redefine the meaning of words does not seem reasonable or acceptable. What I mean by that is you cannot, whatever the author, he meant something, he intended something when he penned it, and that's our job, is to learn exactly what he meant when he penned it. To change what he meant would not be reasonable or acceptable. So we need to study to prove, if we can, what was intended. Throughout the new writings, there are only 9 times mia is redefined from cardinal one or similar meaning to ordinal first, and 9 times Sabbaton is redefined from Sabbath to week. Well, I need to clarify, because as I've done a little more work, this really should have been 8 times that mia is redefined from cardinal one or similar meaning to the ordinal number first. And 9 times, that's true, that Sabbaton was redefined from Sabbath to week. 7 of the occurrences are in concert, and 6 of them occur on Resurrection Day. There is no apparent justification for doing so outside of church teaching. And even if you change the meaning and render incorrectly, at its base remains the Greek modifying Sabbaton in the foundational written documents. To clarify what I would have meant, and maybe this wasn't fair to him because he wouldn't, some of the things I'm clarifying for you now may not have been clear to Ken when he was reading my statement. But here, to clarify, even if you change the meaning and render it incorrectly, even if you change it to the first day of the week, which would be an incorrect rendering if that's what it is, at its base remains Mia modifying Sabbaton as the foundational written document. So I'm just restating again that no matter how we interpret it, the author literally wrote T Miaton Sabbaton, a feminine adjective modifying a neuter noun at its base. And we need to understand that why, and the fact no matter how we render it doesn't change the fact that that's how they wrote it. Is it possible, then I offered, is it possible the writer used poor grammar? Well, okay, admittedly, even here, I knew that that does not seem likely because the authors include Dr. Luke, Matthew, Mark, John, and Paul. It doesn't seem likely that they all are making the same grammatical error with respect to using these two words together. Mia modifying Sabbaton, which clearly appears to be anyway, according to, and I really don't doubt it, according to Ken, incorrect grammar. Is it possible that the Greek language of the time and location, which would be first century in time, and location, which would be the southern kingdom, which would be Yehuda or Judah or the Holy Land, the Promised Land, it's basically the area of Jerusalem. It's in the southern kingdom of Israel. Is it possible that the Greek language of the time and location was just different than what we understand today? So many are offering Miaton Sabbaton as an idiom for the first day of the week. This is what we're hearing from the word idiom has now been cast about as, and the idea of an idiom is that the phrase as it is written means something else. The literal translation doesn't work. It has to have a translation that when you read it becomes clear from context, from idiom of the day, all of it familiar in the context of the day. Okay, so it has to be an idiom. So the idea that Miaton Sabbaton means, because it's an idiom, first day of the week, without any apparent sourcing outside of the limited occasions found in the new writings. Okay, what I would mean to be trying to communicate to him here, and I think he understood it, but what I'm really trying to say is we just have these 10 verses all together where one of the two events has happened, where Mia became first or Sabbaton became week, a total of 10, 6 or 7 of them in concert with each of them, with each other. And this is it. This is all we have for justifying this idea that Miaton Sabbaton would have meant, or Miaton Sabbaton would have meant first day of the week. That's all we've got to justify that. And it's just very limited. If there were culture-specific idioms, why wouldn't there be culture-specific grammar anomalies? Which is what I'm saying. In that culture, if we're going to have culture-specific context, culture-specific idioms, why wouldn't there be culture-specific grammar anomalies? The frequent use of T Miaton Sabbaton. Well, it turns out that in the same quantity that I'm talking about, we have T Miaton Sabbaton, because that phraseology is only, it's not just that it's being translated the 8 times, it only occurs 8 times in the new writings. So the phrase is also rather limited. The use of T Miaton Sabbaton is also rather limited, but it maybe has culture-specific grammar. There's an apparent reason why they are doing what they have done. Okay, so then I made a video this morning covering basically the same ground, and here's a link for anyone interested. Okay. And so Ken took the time, thankfully, thank you, Ken. He took the time to actually delve further into the questions that I have and clarify his statements. And so he made a second response, and this is his second response. Well, thank you for the response. Indeed, my name is Ken. Let me get my pencil. My name is Ken. Great job picking through the Greek. It isn't always easy to do. Also, my apologies for not transliterating each of the Greek words and phrases. I will try to be better at that. And thank you for the time and thought that you put into the response. As a note on Google Translate, it doesn't effectively accommodate grammatical construction, idiom, etc. It is a poor translator for nuance. Additionally, it does only modern Greek rather than Koine Greek, which is the reason it translated Saturday rather than Sabbath. We are 2,000 years removed from the Greek of the New Testament. If you've ever tried to read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which was written 600 years ago, you will recall how linguistic drift operates. The differences between ancient and modern Greek are even better, to which I agree with all of that. This has been my experience with Google Translate. You'll put in T Miaton Sabbaton, and it'll take Sabbaton and translate it as Saturday. Well, that makes no. That's just simply accommodating what we've come to know, assume Sabbaton to mean, born out of the various English translations that have been given to us. Okay, so I agree with all that. Also, as a note, in the use of interlinears, what is translated in an interlinear isn't really a translation of a phrase. Okay, I'm not going to read all of this. I'm just going to explain I agree with him. Interlinears will give us word for word, but Greek will sometimes invert words, and we'll put, if we just go straight from the Greek, translated into the English, our words will be backwards and it will not make sense. So we have to, in order to make it work in English, rearrange words some. So we have to be careful when you're using interlinears, and I do understand that. When I said what is written, I am not speaking of what interlinears are doing. I'm just not speaking to that. But that seems like to be what he's addressing here. So I'm not going to stay with it because I just agree. But when I say this is what is written, it is not, I'm not trying to affirm bad phrase, it wouldn't be bad phraseology, just the difficulties of phraseologies we find in the interlinears. I'm specifically speaking of T miaton Sabbaton, where we do not have the inversion of words. We have literally T miaton Sabbaton, and that's it. And that's what was written, and that's all I was really saying. Okay. So then he goes on to Greek, and this is where I want to get busy. So, to assert that haste, and thus mia cannot mean first, misunderstands the role of cardinal numbers in Greek. So cardinal numbers are things like 1, 2, 3, 4, not necessarily ordinal in nature. As soon as we when we start talking about the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 in an ordinal sense, it becomes first, second, third, fourth, as though we are in some sort of ordered sense. So basically what he's saying is that to say that mia in haste cannot mean first in an ordinal sense misunderstands the role of cardinal numbers in Greek. While usually ordinal numbers are used to refer to first, second, etc., cardinal numbers, and especially haste, are also used to refer to things like first, second, and third. This is especially true when it modifies nouns of time, the temporal use you noted in your recent video. Okay, some comments here on this, because I'm not gonna be able to take you through the entire walk that I did to test out everything that Ken is saying, because the video, I've already tried it and it became a 4.5 hour long video. I'm hoping this one won't be that way. But let me just tell you that the work that I did when I tested what he's saying here, is that it is not especially true that haste or one becomes things like first or second and third when it modifies nouns of time. I'm going to say it exclusively needs to modify a noun of time to be translated into first. So what I'm going to say here, as I tested it out, is that haste, which I actually never found haste used in the ordinal sense. I don't have any examples of haste, the masculine form of one, being translated into first. We do have, and I don't know of any henny, actually, I don't think there are any examples of henny being translated as first, but we have examples of mia, which is the feminine form of one, being translated into first. But I will say I did not find any time where mia all by itself would be translated into first, second, or third. It required the insertion of day before it. So it would be day one, and specifically referring to day one in some sense of this noun of time, which could be a week, could be a month, could be a day, but only if it's broken into units smaller than a day. A week can be broken into units of a day. A month could be broken into units of weeks or days. A year could be broken into units of months, weeks, days, etc. But they all require some noun of time, which is what I've come to, if I'm understanding what he has offered to me here, that's temporal use of a noun. So when we say a temporal noun, it's one that's modifying or is intended to be a noun of time, like year, month, week, etc. One example, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, when I was doing this research in the Septuagint, I found day one of the creation account. And in the translation that they gave us in English, that became first day. And at first blush, you're saying, well, okay, where's the temporal noun? Well, the assumed temporal noun is that is a week long. The creation account is a week long. We have 7 days of that of creation, and so the noun of time, the temporal noun, would be week, and it has to be supplied by context to know that when we say day 1, there's going to be a day 2, there's going to be a day 3, all of them of the week, and that's how we're getting to first. So let me now take what he says here, where he says, especially haste, which is 1, and actually I'm going to say mia, are also used to refer to things like first, second, and third. And I'm going to say no, not mia, not haste, not hinting, never are they all by themselves translated into first, second, or third. We're going to require something else to go along with it. Day, and day is what we always see, but you could say a minute 1, you could say week 1, you could say all kinds of things to turn it into a first, second, or third, but always in the context that there was a second one coming, a third one coming. So it's exclusively and not especially going to have to modify a noun of time. That's what I'm finding as I go through it and evaluate. So just to say that haste can be changed to first is not, I'm going to say, not fair, because you need to have day inserted there. And to say especially true is also not fair, because it needs to be exclusively true. Then he goes on to say, we see this multiple times in biblical passages outside the phrases where it's used in conjunction with Sabbaton. Okay, as well as in secular Greek. Well, okay, so what he's saying is that when we get into haste, and actually it'd be mia in the new writings, because that's where we see it happening, even when we're going to get into a little bit of the Septuagint here too, where we see mian and sabbatu combined in the old writings for the only one time in those old writings, and in the superscript of the Psalms of the Septuagint. But what he's talking about is all the passages in question seem to have mia and Sabbaton together. And he's saying, well, there are times that it happens outside of mia and Sabbaton being used together. But he went on to say multiple, and I'm going to cry foul. I'm going to say that's not fair, because he gives us this example of Revelation 9:12, where we read the first, and then he put in parentheses mia, woe is past. So we see this Greek phrase that is translated as, I don't know how to say this word, but we'll say he, we, he, mia, appealthin. I'm sure I'm butchering that. But he's offering this as one of multiple examples. Well, let me show you. Here is the phrase in question. It's Revelation 9:12. And here's the transliterated Greek in the Greek that he just offered us. He's saying is being translated as first, woe is past. And if you go to the NASB and many translations, that's what you'll find. Even the Hallelujah scriptures, which I find to be the best literal word for word translating scriptures that I have found, even there, I think they are missing it here and doing injustice to the word. Because how does the King James translate it? One woe is past, and behold, there comes 2 woes more hereafter. And this actually is the correct translation, because he's saying, we don't see Sabbaton here. We're not talking about Sabbaton here. He's saying that in English, it's being translated to first woe. And okay, it can be translated into first woe, but it doesn't have to be, because it's just as literally, in fact, it's more literally correct to translate just like the King James did, where it says 1 woe is past, and behold, there comes 2 woes more hereafter. So in English, you could say the first woe is past, and behold, there comes 2 woes more hereafter. And that would be okay in English, but it's not a literal translation of the Greek. And so to use it as an example where mia was being used as first legitimately in the Greek is just not, it doesn't assert that first could and should be used. It just says that it can be used in the English translated as first, but it's still ordinal in sense, because we have a second one coming. And so you have to add woe in that sense. So you would have, here you have the first woe. Something to go along with mia to get a second. You can't just have mia all by itself. And this Revelation 9:12, this is it. This is the only occurrence that you've got. Now, there are no multiple occurrences. It's this 9:12, Revelation 9:12, that's it. And it doesn't even need to be and shouldn't probably be translated as first. Okay, then he goes on to offer the Septuagint, which is what this is. This is, the Roman numerals for 70, which is the Septuagint. Of Numbers 1:1, he's going to show us, I'll just read what he wrote. The Septuagint has a particular interesting example in Numbers 1:1. We read, and he gives us the Greek, and here it is in the transliterated Greek, in mia tu minos tu deutero, where the English translations nearly universally have the first day of the second month. Here we see the cardinal number 1, mia, in both the Hebrew and the Greek, but to make proper English, we translate it as an ordinal first. But also day is missing in both the Hebrew and the Greek, and is required to be inserted for the passage to make sense. So once again, he's introducing the idea of ellipsis, which we will get into in just a bit here. But he's offering this as an example where the cardinal number 1, mia, is being translated as first, and that's necessary to make proper English. But here I'm going to cry. I'm just going to say that's also not fair. Because we do have, I don't argue that it is universally translated as the first day of the second month, because it can be in English. But the literal translation of the passage, the words in question, the Greek, transliterated Greek in question, is this mia, in mia tu minos. And mia is a feminine noun modifying a feminine adjective modifying a masculine noun. So we have that same grammatical problem where it must be an ellipsis because we have misalignment of gender, which can't be in the Greek language. And so you have to insert day. And that's what he's saying. So really, I think it's universally understood that day is going to be inserted before mia. And we're going to see as we go through, but that transliterated word for day is hemera. And so it's going to be hemerati, in hemera mia tu minos will be the literal translation, day 1 of the month. So while we can and do translate it as first day of the second month, it's really always going to be day 1 of the month. And while that may be, I don't even think it's awkward English, but while it may not be the most comfortably used English, and you could say day 1 of the month, you could in English say first day of the month. You can do that, which is what we see in the translations, but you don't have to, because day 1 of the month is proper English. So here's where I'm saying, no, I disagree. I don't think this is fair, because proper English exists with day 1 of the month. It's not a matter of making proper English. It's a matter of just converting to what we think is more smooth English, more convenient English, the more common use of the English language for the people who translated from the Greek of the Septuagint into the English. So we're translating it as an ordinal first, but not to make proper English. This is what I say is unfair, but to make a convenient English. And okay, so a day is missing in Greek, so ellipsis. Okay, in fact, here's where he's going to explain ellipses. As seen in Numbers 1:1, it is common for Greek to omit words when they are clear from idiom and context. And when he says clear, I'm going to say he means evident. You would know from idiom and context. So when in the Greek language, a writer is going to leave a word out and create incorrect grammar, it's because they can, apparently, because what they were trying to convey, their readers and hearers of the time and in that language would have understood either the context or the idiom. Now, I think it's more context than idiom, because idiom is thrown about an awful lot, when I don't think idiom is fair either. Okay, so he says this is called ellipses. Well, it's actually ellipsis, and this is the plural form of ellipses. But that is, I won't even. I will go ahead and read the Merriam-Webster definition of that. Okay, so here's the Merriam-Webster definition of ellipsis. It's the omission of one or more words that are obviously understood, but that must be supplied to make a construction, I'm going to say a sentence construction grammatically complete. So in order for a sentence to be grammatically complete, you have to supply the word that was left out, but must be obviously understood. And that's exactly what he's saying. The omission of one or more words that are obviously understood, but that must be supplied to make a construction grammatically complete. Okay, that's what he said here, that they are clear from idiom and context. Okay, similarly in Matthew 10:42, I'm not going to go on to explain this because he gives me an example of some ellipses where if you don't supply the word, if you don't presume the word, then you cannot make sense of what is being said. Well, I agree. I'm not even going to bother. There's nothing to argue about. I embrace and agree. And I mean, how could I do anything other but embrace and agree with the idea that ellipsis is common in the language, commonly used, and we have to figure out what to do with it. He goes on to say, ellipses is well documented not just in the New Testament, but in Papyri and Hellenistic inscriptions. Thus, if a phrase doesn't make sense as written, such as a feminine adjective seemingly modifying a neuter noun, okay, I'm going to finish this sentence and then come back to that. The proper course of action would be to look for another word in context or an idiom that could relate, as opposed to assuming that multiple New Testament writers made a grammatical mistake that needs to be corrected, or that someone changed the text after the fact, especially given that there is zero textual evidence for such a change. Okay, so what I'm going to say here is I don't think this is fair. We do have a feminine adjective seemingly modifying a neuter noun. We definitely have incorrect grammar, and we have an ellipsis, and we need to supply a word. But the fact that the sentence structure is not complete, it's grammatically incorrect, does not mean that the phrase doesn't make sense. For example, ti mia ton Sabbaton means on one of the Sabbaths. To suggest that on one of the Sabbaths doesn't make sense. I don't think it's a fair statement. It may not be grammatically correct, but it does make sense. And if we supply, and I'll just say it here, if you supply the missing word days, as he has said we need to, and we supply it behind Sabbath days, then it becomes on one of the Sabbath days, and we still have the same concept. We haven't changed anything. It's still plural in nature, because where it says on one of the Sabbaths, now we're saying on one of the Sabbath days, we still have the plurality of it, and that all makes sense, and it all has the same meaning. So it isn't a matter of what they're saying, ti mia ton Sabbaton, not making sense. It's just grammatically correct. So I say I cry foul here. I say this is not fair. I do agree that the proper course of action when we have an ellipsis is to look for or consider the word in context, which they would have understood either by idiom, which I don't think this phrase is an idiom. I just don't think it's an idiom. I think it's to be taken literally and not be considered an idiom for something else. But it is context. Context provides the word that we need to place in there to make the sentence grammatically correct. He goes on to write, the point of my original comment was that because the original readers knew how Greek grammar works and knew that there is always gender agreement between nouns and adjectives that modify them, that they would have naturally looked for what word was missing, relying on idiom and or context. Agree with that statement. Agree wholeheartedly with that statement, that they could rely on idiom and they could rely on context. In this case, I think they're relying on context and not idiom, even though that's what the church has given us. But here's where he goes on to say, rather than accept a meaning that the grammar clearly precludes. Again, I call this a foul. It's not fair, because the meaning that the grammar gives us is ti mia ton Sabbaton. The meaning that it gives us is on one of the Sabbaths. And he's saying that the incorrect grammar precludes that as its meaning, where I can fix the grammar on one of the Sabbath days and it is the exact same meaning. So it does not preclude. I think it's unfair to say that the grammar precludes understanding ti mia ton Sabbaton to be literally what it said, on one of the Sabbaths. just because we're missing a day and have to add it after Sabbath. So we have on one of the Sabbath days. For us to do anything less misses how the original readers would have processed the phrase. Okay, so I guess I don't really need to comment to this phrase, but I will just say this is suggesting that if we don't preclude on one of the Sabbaths because of the grammar, if we don't preclude on one of the Sabbaths as the option, then we're doing less than the readers would have processed, how they would have processed the phrase. And I think that I'm going to call that a foul also. I'm going to call that unfair, because I just think that is pressing the issue that the incorrect grammar is precluding the express words meaning on one of the Sabbaths. Okay, then he goes on to say, and there's a common idiom in first century Jewish Greek that provides day with Sabbath. And then Septuagint's Greek, the phrase, this is the Greek, and in transliterated, it's ti himera, and here's that word for day I was talking about. So it's ti himera ton Sabbaton, which is often translated as the day of the Sabbath. And then which translates this, which is, I think this is the Hebrew for Hasabbat. This would be Sabbath, day of the Sabbath in the Hebrew. So this is being utilized. Ti himera ton Sabbaton is being translated from this Hebrew bion Hasabbat into the day of the Sabbath, which is often translated into English as the Sabbath day. Okay, and I agree. I have tested this. It's very common in the Septuagint. Here he gives us some examples of it in the Septuagint. It's all over the place in the Septuagint. I will agree. I went looking and doing some word searches and can confirm that it's all over the place. It's a commonly used phrase in the Old Testament, most commonly translated as the Sabbath day or the Sabbath, one of those two things. And then he says this idiom is then picked up by the New Testament Greek. For instance, we see in Luke chapter 4, verse 16, Luke chapter 13, verses 14 and 16, and Acts chapter 13, verses 14. So I will agree that first of all, no, let me disagree here, because it says this idiom. Why is he calling this an idiom? Literally, it means the day of the Sabbath day. It has a literal meaning. It doesn't mean something other than the words are saying. You may want to move off to some more convenient way of saying it in English, as we do, the Sabbath day, but it doesn't make it an idiom. And so I say this is unfair. I cry foul here. Then he goes on to say that it's picked up, and I do agree. I find it 4 times in the new writings, and this is it, 4 times. And the author of Luke and the author of Acts is Dr. Luke. So Dr. Luke picked up ti himera ton Sabbaton, or actually probably wrote in the Greek, but he picked up ti himera ton Sabbaton and used it in the new writings. And then that is translated as some form of the Sabbath day or a Sabbath day. Similar meaning to what we saw in the Septuagint, and I agree with all of that. This is one way of saying the day of the Sabbath or the Sabbath day or the Sabbaths. And a number of other places where Greek has day of the Sabbaths, and that would be true, because that would be, ton Sabbaton is Sabbath, day of the Sabbath, to refer to the Sabbath day. But I will say that also here, I don't know how germane it is, but it isn't always Sabbaths. It's not always plural. Sometimes I think it's Sabbatou. I think that'd be the word that they use, Sabbatou with a T-O-U. T-O-U, as the transliterated Greek. Sometimes we're going to see it in the singular, which is what Sabbatou is, day of the Sabbath. But all of it seems to refer to the Sabbath day, or the meaning of, or something similar to the meaning of the Sabbath day, all of which we agree with that. So he hasn't said anything here other than give us information that I agree with, except for the fact that he's calling it an idiom, and I don't think it's an idiom. Please note that the Septuagint translates a Greek plural for the Hebrew singular, as the Hebrew typically doesn't have Sabbatot. Okay, so this sentence is a little strange for me, so I'm not sure, but I think I get the idea that it translates a Greek plural for the Hebrew singular. So where it's written in the Hebrew as singular, it's translated into the Greek as plural. Well, as I started looking, I don't know that we don't have Hebrew I could be wrong here, but when we're talking in the Hebrew, when they're referencing the Sabbath, I don't know that they don't have plural versions of it. I really don't know for sure what he's saying here, if he's saying there are no plural versions of it. And I guess in a way, I would have to go looking at it again. It's possible there are no plural versions of it, but I don't think so. I did a word search on it and found lots of words used for Sabbath in the Hebrew, and I think I saw plural versions of it. But he goes on to explain what he means here is that this demonstrates that the plural doesn't necessarily mean Sabbath is plural. So what he's saying is when the plural Sabbaton is used, which is to be literally translated as Sabbaths and is a plural word, but I think he's saying it's not always meant to be a plural word, and that it's an artifact of the idiom translated into the Greek. Well, I don't know that it's an artifact I don't know even what to do with this statement because of how it's worded. And I don't know that it's an artifact of an idiom so much as I can explain, it's for instance, when we say Sabbaton in Timiaton Sabbaton, and now we've got the plural Sabbath, Sabbaton. But if we're going to insert the word day, then really we don't want to retain plural Sabbaths, because then it would be Sabbath day or Sabbath's days. It doesn't work. It needs to become singular in nature because days is plural to retain the plural nature of the thought. But in that sense, we're using Sabbaton in the sense that when we supply the missing word for the ellipsis, we now turn it into a singular noun. And that's what I really thought he was saying. But I will say here that while he's making this comment and this statement, I think I did find other passages where the use of Sabbaton could be rendered into English, just as easily into English, and maybe even in the Greek as a singular Sabbath and retain the thought. And that in some translations, we see them actually do that. But I think that's taking advantage of Sabbaton. I think when the Greek writer wrote Sabbaton, he meant Sabbaths over and over again. The fact that we can understand the meaning, even if we change it to singular, I still think that's wrong translation. We should not have done it, even though it could make sense using the singular. But he calls it an artifact of the idiom translated into Greek. And I don't know. I think he might, when he says artifact of the idiom, he might actually, when I think about it, he might be referring to what he's calling this idiom here now, because we don't always see Sabbaton being used in this phrase. Sometimes we see Sabbatu. And so maybe that's what he's saying is the artifact of this idiom, and he's calling Timiaton Sabbaton an idiom. Maybe. Okay, so let's keep moving on. One concern you express is why Sabbath is rendered as week. Well, I am concerned with why Sabbath is rendered as week, because you don't see it. You only see it in 9 places in the new writings, and you don't see it at all in the old writings of our typical English translations. You have to get into the Septuagint, where they've added superscripts to get into the one time, actually the 3 times that Sabbath is also rendered as week, trying to make context work for what they did in the Septuagint. Okay, but he says, I don't think it was in the mind of the original reader. I think he's saying that Sabbath was not in the mind of the original reader. But I don't know for sure what he means when he says, I don't think it was in the mind of the original reader. But he does reveal what I think is foundational to his system of moving, translating Timiaton Sabbaton as first day of the week, because he says instead the Sabbath was the day of the Sabbath. So he's saying that, I think he's saying that the Sabbath, if you were trying to refer to the day of the Sabbath, you would have said the day of the Sabbath, which is T Himera Ton Sabbatu, because this is singular. And he's saying that's what, if you were trying to refer to the Sabbath, that's how you would have said it. Now, I'm just going to say here that that's not the only way it's going. If you were trying to refer to the Sabbath or a Sabbath, they literally said tu Sabbatu, the Sabbath. And there were other times that onto other ways that they were communicating without going to this Tihimeraton Sabbatu. I'm sorry, Tihimeraton Sabbatu. maybe it was T Sabbatou. I don't really know for sure how it would, I'd have to look at it, but without going to T Hemeraton Sabbaton or Sabbatou. But here's where he makes the statement, the day after the Sabbath. If you were trying to convey Sunday, the day after the Sabbath, then you would have said T Mia Tone Sabbaton and inserting the missing day here. So if you were trying to say the day after, you would have said T Mia Tone Sabbaton. This is his assertion that the day after was denoted idiomatically as the day of the Sabbaths. Okay, that's a big assertion. Well, let me first just say that as I went exploring through the Septuagint, there are literal phrases of the day after the Sabbath that has nothing to do. They've got a couple different times where they are communicating day after the Sabbath. In fact, let me go find that real quick. And so here we are in Leviticus 23, and here is the Greek phrase, literally written in Greek and being translated as the day after the Sabbath. See if I can get rid of that. The day after the Sabbath. And in using Bing Translator, when we punch in this Greek here into Greek Translator, it translates as on the day after the Sabbath. So going back to his comment, he's saying if you meant to communicate the day after the Sabbath, you would have said Ti Miaton Sabbaton rather than this Greek phraseology here that existed. Well, okay, so that's what he's asserting. But I think that we are stretching and we're introducing things. But I think this is the rationale that needs to be applied to get us to the first day of the week successfully. I think so. Let's finish his thoughts here. The day after the Sabbath was denoted idiomatically as one day of the Sabbath. So I'm just going to say, which he said is meaning one day from the Sabbath. I'm just going to say that statement I'm going to say is unfair. Because, first of all, he would have to show me where it's, you can say it, Ti Miaton Sabbaton was an idiom for the day after the Sabbath if you need it to be the day after the Sabbath and our Sunday, and you utilize, what are you going to utilize to get to that idiomatic, that idea of it being that idiom, meaning that idiom? Well, you're going to go back to the same passages where we have Sabbath being translated as week. And to arrive at this and make these assertions in the face of other ways to say the day after the Sabbath, if that was your meaning, you would not make the awkward phraseology of one day of the Sabbath. I don't think you wouldn't be saying one day from the Sabbath. But I think that this concept can be employed when we do get into the Septuagint and the Psalms in question. But I still say it's unfair to say that because he is suggesting that that's what Ti Miaton Sabbaton is. It would mean the day after the Sabbath because that's how you would say it. And that's just it's not 100% true. Okay, I won't keep beating it. I'll see if it comes up and becomes more clarified as we move through. You note that there are no other examples where Mia, modifying Sabbaton, is translated as first day of the week. And that isn't quite accurate. In the Septuagint, a number of the Psalms have introductory superscriptions introducing the Psalm, and these don't exist in the Masoretic, and that's true. So we won't find them in our English translations that were based upon the Masoretic text, but you will find these superscriptions above, certain types of superscriptions above the Psalms in the Septuagint. And then he goes on to say, the Masoretic text is the basis for most English translations, and that's true. And as you probably know, the Septuagint is a Jewish translation that's roughly contemporaneous with the New Testament, being slightly older, and is the basis for most New Testament quotes. Well, it's about 300 years prior to, so contemporaneous is in that it's in the same millennium, but it's still 300 years away. It would be like saying, going back to, the formation of America from here. It's that kind of time frame away that the Septuagint would have been created out of the Hebrew. And I would also say, just for clarification, during the time of the new writings, which is when Messiah came to earth and we had the disciples, the apostles, and all the writings that took place, the gospel accounts, etc. During that time, they not only would have had the Septuagint available in all of these Greek-speaking locations because they were clearly speaking Greek in the Holy Land alongside of Hebrew in the Holy Land. But it's not just the Septuagint that they would have had. They would have still had at that time the actual Hebrew scriptures from which the Septuagint was created. So when we see the New Testament, the various New Testament quotes referencing old writings that don't seem to match up with the Masoretic text that we see when we go back and try to test these quotes against the Old Testament in our Bibles, what we find is that when we go to the Septuagint, they more closely align with the New Testament quotes, which is suggesting they're either reading from the Septuagint, or I would say more probably they were reading from the Hebrew scriptures that were still around during the time and from which the Septuagint was translated. And I doubt that the superscripts that we see in the Septuagint, I doubt that they were actually written at the same time that the original Septuagint was written. And we had these various scribes, the 70 scribes, translate Hebrew into Greek, and then they conglomerated them into the Septuagint that became, the Greek version of the old writings. I doubt that they had these superscriptions at that time. My guess is that superscriptions were added as the scribes kept translating and rescribing the various, because obviously the scripts don't last forever. They have to be replaced. So you have scribes continuing to pen them. And we have accounts. I've heard of accounts where the Pharisees actually, in the first couple centuries of this millennium, of the first millennium, that where they had retranslated and introduced the Septuagint and made revisions to the Septuagint because they needed, just like they did with the Masoretic text, they needed certain things for their doctrinal purposes. So the superscriptions could have come about over time and not been part of the original Septuagint, and those superscriptions became part of, just part of retranslations, maybe. But here he points out the two Psalm superscriptions in question, and where we see the exact form of number of the Sabbaths. Well, okay. I'm not sure exactly what he means by this. I have to infer what he means by this. But then he gives us two examples of where we have mias. So we have mias, Sabbaton. Now he put Sabbaton in here and then transliterated it as mias Sabbaton. But this is error because this word is actually Sabbatu when we actually get to Psalm 24:1. And he does the same thing when he offers us 94:1, where we've got this tetrady, Sabbaton, that is transliterated as tetrady. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. Or fourth. And again, he says Sabbaton when it says Sabbatu. So what does he say? He says, so what do those mean? The good news is that we have extra biblical Jewish sources that tell us the Jewish temple service had daily readings of the Psalms. Well, okay, this will be interesting because he says Jewish temple service, and I think I need to differentiate between the idea of Jewish as Judaism has become synonymous with Judaism, which is a form of religion that has a whole grouping of text and scriptures and things, writings that form the basis of their religious understandings. And the basis of Judaism are the oral traditions that we heard referenced in the gospel accounts that Yahushua actually, chastised. These oral traditions, they were not doctrines of Elohim, they were doctrines of men. Well, ultimately, those oral traditions, I can't remember what century, but it was post-Messiah. It was into centuries later, past the time of Messiah, that the oral traditions were ultimately committed into writing, which became Mishnah. And then we also have the whole Talmud. That's why we hear phrases like Talmudic Judaism, where they are using the Talmud, which are now the written, they would call them scriptures. I'm assuming they would, but they're written writings that are from the oral traditions. So I would separate and need to nuance that because he says Jewish service, as though this was the service of Judaism, what we understand to be Judaism today, and that faith. I would say that the temple service that took place, first of all, you had temple service on up to 175 BC that would have been run and led by the legitimate priesthood, which the high priest, the only high priests that were legitimate were the sons of Zadok by this time, of the Aaronic priesthood. What was left and still serving until 175 BC were the sons of Zadok. But in 175 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, because of issues related to the calendar and other things, needed to eliminate these problematic sons of Zadok who would not go along with what he needed for him to Hellenize the Holy Lands. So ultimately, he just removed the Zadokian priests and replaced it with Hellenistic priests. And then we had the rising of the Maccabees while the Hellenistic priests were in place, and the Maccabees basically having good success against the Greeks, and then ultimately inserting the Maccabean, the Maccabean lineage, which is the Hasmonean lineage, into the high priesthood, which remained then illegitimate priesthood. They did not reinsert the sons of Zadok, which existed, because the Zadoks, the family, the people of the Zadoks, ended up, when they were kicked out of the temple and out of the leadership positions of the temple, they were exiled. And when they were exiled, they went off to Bethabara, where they formed the compound. And I think this would then be the center, the hub, where we would see the Zadokites trying to maintain true Torah. And so that's Bethabara. That's what we understand today to be Qumran. And I'll just quickly say that is what Yahushua, or Jesus, actually validated, because he did not come to the temple or the priests of the temple to receive his anointing for his ministry. He came to John, who was almost certainly a priest, because he already had, and a prominent priest, because he already had Talmudim disciples by that time. So I think that when John went off into the wilderness and into the wilderness, he went off to this compound where he was part of this priesthood, this whole society of trying to maintain Torah according to Zadok and Torah, just the traditions of Torah, that he rose to the position of priest, and possibly even what would have been considered high priest. I don't know. I've heard people assert that. I don't know that I could go along with that, but he certainly rose to the position of priest. And when he came onto the scene, teaching in the areas of Judea, he did not come out of nowhere. He came out of this well-known compound and this well-known grouping of people who now had become really averse to mainstream Yehudism or Judaism, because even though they were the correct priesthood, the correct lineage, they were the remnant of Israel, they became the minority in Israel, as all of Israel followed the new priest and the Hasmonean priests and the leadership that they gave. That I think when it all comes down, I'll stop doing that because I've got other videos where I've developed those themes. But what I'm saying is, when we say Jewish as in Judaism, this did not come about until after the sons of Zadok have been removed. So the temple service from 175-ish on up to 70 AD, when the temple was ultimately destroyed, these temple services were being run by priests, illegitimate. Well, the Levites that would have been running them would not have been illegitimate, but the leadership that was over the Levitical priests that were giving us so many doctrines and these oral traditions would have all been legitimate. So from 175 BC to 70 AD, for more than 200 years, it would be more than 200 years, like 240, 245 years, something like that, we had errant temple service. So when we start using Mishnah and Jewish temple service, and we start validating with this, we have to be very careful, because I think the Mishnah and the oral traditions and Judaism are born out of errant understanding of Torah, as proven to us through Yehushua's chastisement and John the Baptist's chastisement, and the Dead Sea Scrolls chastisement of the oral traditions and the Pharisees at the time. So we have to be careful when we do this. But he goes on to say, we read that Psalm 24 is to be read on the first day of the week. We also see that that same directive in Rosh Hashanah 31. And a few paragraphs later, we see a similar statement regarding Psalm 94:1. Thus, we have definitive evidence from contemporaneous Jewish sources that Psalm 24 is for the first day of the week, which aligns perfectly if the form of Mia Sabbaton is translated as first day of the week. And quite frankly makes any other rendering of the Septuagint's phrase at the start of Psalm 24:1 somewhat perplexing. Okay, I cry foul here, and I'm going to go and explain this and spend a little time. I'm sorry. But this is an unfair statement. I cry foul. It isn't perplexing because literally what we're going to see is Mia and Sabbath too, and it literally can mean one Sabbath. Could be one Sabbath day, one day of the Sabbath, but it doesn't mean that it has to be rendered first day of the week for it to make sense. Now, admittedly, when we combine it with the other things we're going to find in this Tamid 7 and a couple of the other Psalms that we're going to visit here quickly, then it does get a little more perplexing, admittedly so. But let me go visit these Psalms that are in question. Let me pull up the Mishnah first. Okay, so here's the Mishnah Tamid 7:4. And it reads like this. The following is a list of each daily psalm that the Levites would recite in the temple. On the first day of the week, they would recite the psalm beginning, a psalm of David. The earth is the Lord's and all that it contains, or all it contains, the world and all who live in it, which is Psalms chapter 24. Then they go on to tell us what's going to be read on the second day. Then they're going to tell us what's going to be read on the third day, and the fourth day, and the fifth day, and the sixth day, and then on the Shabbat, which is Sabbath day. So in this writing, they're going to tell us the sequence of Psalms that are going to be read during the course of a week. Let's also quickly visit the other Jewish document that Ken gave me, and it would be the Rosh Hashanah 31a, and it reads like this. The Gemara expands on the topic of the daily Psalms recited by the Levites. It is taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Akiva on the first day of the week, Sunday, what psalm would be read? What psalm would the Levites recite? The psalm beginning with the phrase, the earth is the Lord's and its fullness. So what is the source of this information? What is the authority of this information? I haven't really tested this out, and I'm not going to here, but it goes along with the idea that, how much weight do we give the oral traditions and therefore the Mishnah of Judaism in terms of telling us what was taking place in the temple service. First of all, it's taught in a Baraita, which I haven't looked that up. I need to look that word up at some point. That Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Is this the authority for what we're dealing with right now? I don't know. But taking a look at this Mishnah, let's break down the various Psalms that they're referencing here and test this a little bit. So here we are in Psalm 24, and here is the Greek in question. And let me point out, this is not Sabbaton, this is Sabbath. This is actually Sabbatou, which is singular, and Sabbath. So the Greek phrase here is not on one of the Sabbaths, it's literally on one Sabbath. So that's kind of interesting. What do you do with that? If you were to take that literally, is that perplexing? On one Sabbath, a psalm for David on one Sabbath? Because that's what this would mean. You've got the first part of this, which is being translated as a psalm for David on one Sabbath. All by itself, it would not be strange or perplexing. It's only strange or perplexing. Well, it might be strange or perplexing why they superscripted that at all, because I'm not sure that they have that instruction elsewhere. But that's what they gave, but it's not all perplexing all by itself unless we start adding other days to it and trying to come up with a series of Psalms to read through a week. But literally, on one Sabbath just literally means on one Sabbath. But if we have to, because we have a feminine mia and a neuter noun, so if we have to add a word, first of all, I know that this is established all the time as a feminine noun, but let me show you something else here real quick. And I'm not suggesting this is germane or even probably germane, but I make this observation that we're supposed to have this masculine form of haste up here. And that's what they give us. It's an adjective, nominative, masculine, singular. And then we have this mia, which is supposed to be feminine. And that's what we have, an adjective, nominative, feminine, singular. Here's the dative, feminine, singular. Here's the accusative feminine singular and the genitive feminine singular. But when we get to these Greek words, hen and henna and henny, which would have been my understanding that these should have been neuter forms of the noun, well, what we find is some moving back and forth, because this hen, while it is a neuter singular, seems to be all the time, when we get to this henna, now we've turned henna into a masculine. So we have an accusative masculine singular. And then when we get to henni, which was the word that Ken gave us to represent a neuter form of the adjective so that it would correspond with the neuter noun, well, we find that in some cases it is neuter, but in some cases it's also masculine. So we have apparently some moving back and forth in the gender of this henny adjective. And the same thing would hold true for henos, which is supposed to be neuter, also sometimes used as masculine. So what I'm really saying is we do have some times where we get into different genders of some of these adjectives. I'm not saying that's what took place here, but I don't really know either, because if, though, mias has times in the Greek language, especially back then, where it could have a neuter gender, well, okay, then you wouldn't need to insert a day. That's a possibility, even if it's a remote possibility. And I'm sure, Greek scholars would say, right, no. And okay, but let's just say then that it stays the feminine adjective. And then we have to insert a word here, which we always think is day. So then what do? It could be one day of the Sabbath, day one of the Sabbath, but still, or maybe one Sabbath day. Now, really, one Sabbath day has the exact same meaning as one Sabbath. A psalm for David on one Sabbath day means the exact same thing. But if you put day in front of mias, it's day one Sabbath. Does that make sense? Day one Sabbath. Do you have to change the gender? The number of Sabbaton to be Sabbaton at that point in time because you're inserting day before mias? Maybe. What if you put day after mias, which would become one day Sabbath? Well, it doesn't make sense. Neither day one Sabbath nor one day Sabbath makes any sense. And you would have to, we have no definite article in front of Sabbatou. I think to render what I believe to be ultimately Ken's position in this, where timiaton Sabbaton means one day of the Sabbath as then removed from the Sabbath day, one day of the Sabbath, one day from the Sabbath. Even if you stay with that and you try to apply that to this one, we're missing the definite article that would go along with it, because we would need it to be something like mias, hemera, ton, Sabbaton. It would need to be one day of the Sabbath. So we're missing a definite article here. Only if we put day here do we not need to add a definite article. And can we stay with this idea? And it remains the same idea. A Psalm of David on one Sabbath day. That's not perplexing. It just means it's a Psalm of David on a Sabbath day, or for a Sabbath day, to read on a Sabbath day. Maybe that was David. They're saying that's David's intent. I really don't know. But I don't find that to be perplexing until they start trying to define it as first day of the week. Then that becomes perplexing, because why are we moving Sabbatou to week again? We only, as I said early in the video, we see it only being done where Sabbaton or Sabbatou, this is the other word that's being translated into week in the new writings, where it's being translated into week 9 times in the new writings, 0 times in the Masoretic Old Old Testament or Old Covenant, old writings. And here we got this time in the Septuagint version and the superscripts of the Psalms where we're seeing it translated into week. And I'm going to show you 2 more times, and the only other 2 times where they have elected to change the definition of Sabbath into week. Okay, let's return to the Mishnah and see what they say. On the 2nd day, they would recite this psalm, chapter 48. Well, let's go look at chapter, which is actually Psalm 48. Okay, so here's the superscript for Psalm 48. And it reads, this is all the Greek to basically amount to a psalm of praise for the sons of Korah. And then we have this, I think that would be deutero or something like that, but it's meant to be second Sabbath. And we have Sabbaton again, so it's not plural, it's singular. So literally we would have second Sabbath. And it should read maybe a psalm of praise for the sons of Korah, second Sabbath. Okay, first of all, we have to assume that second could be feminine, modifying a singular Sabbath here, Sabbaton. Once again, it's Sabbaton being rendered as week on us here. But if we assume that second is feminine versus neuter, if it's neuter, we don't need to do anything. It's second Sabbath. It's a psalm of praise for the sons of Korah, second Sabbath. But if we assume that we've got a feminine second here, which is an ordinal number, modifying the singular noun for Sabbath, neuter noun for Sabbath, and we have to insert day, then it would be, what are our options? We could go day, second Sabbath. That makes no sense. We could go, we could put day after, oops, I'm so sorry. We could put day after second and second day Sabbath. Would that make sense? I think, again, to stay with what I believe Ken would say is that you have to insert second day, and then you also have to insert the definite article of the Sabbath, second day of the Sabbath, but second day or second day from. But really, to use the rationale that he's using, I'm not sure that it makes good sense either. But what if it's just day? We have to insert day here, second Sabbath day. We don't change any idea. We have a psalm of praise for the sons of Korah on second Sabbath day. Is that perplexing? Is it perplexing to say sons of Sabbath on second Sabbath day? It might be perplexing as to why we are even saying second Sabbath. Why did this superscript get added and we're saying second Sabbath here? Because I'm going to take this opportunity to say that we have 150 plus Psalms in our English translations. We got 160 plus in the Septuagint, and we have more than that we can find elsewhere where there are other Psalms that are offered up. Well, why aren't any of the other because they're going to give us, let me just say, they're going to give us in that Mishnah Tamid, they're going to give us Psalms to read on 7 days. Are these 7 Psalms are going to give us the only Psalms that get read throughout a week, and they're being read over and over and over and over and over again for 52 weeks of the year, the same ones over and over again? We never move on to another Sabbath? Well, if you take what we're reading in the Mishnah Tamid, that's what it would suggest, because we don't have other evidences. And I'll tell you what else I did. I went through all of these superscripts of the Psalms in the Septuagint, and I find very few references to anything related to, well, we have this one, we have the one we just read in Psalm 24. We're going to have one more where we're seeing a reference to I think 2 more, I'm sorry, where we're seeing reference to timing of the reading of these Psalms in relationship maybe to the Sabbath or a day of, maybe, but we don't see any of the other superscripts suggesting that they are related to reading on a certain day of the week or certain Sabbath or any particular time. So why? That might be perplexing to me, is why are we segregating 2 or 3, maybe 4 Psalms out of all of them to be read? I mean, obviously read or suggestively read on some day related in relation to the Sabbath. I don't know. That's more perplexing to me than the idea that T me is Sabbath 2, which would be one Sabbath day. That's not perplexing to me. It only becomes perplexing when I see this as one of 2 or 3 or 4 Psalms being separated out like this. And here we have it again in Psalm 48. Second Sabbath day works. It only becomes perplexing as to when we start considering why second Sabbath day is in there when we don't have that same kind of instruction throughout. And here's though where they just, they have rendered it in English as second day of the week, and we have that here. Okay. But that's the English rendering of this, and that's more perplexing. Again, we've taken Sabbaton and changed it into week. One of 3 times I believe that this happens. Let's keep on moving through the Mishnah here, because then they move on to day 3. On the 3rd day, they would recite the Psalm, basically chapter 82. Well, let's look at Psalm 82. Well, here it is. Here's Psalm 82. And they did identify, if I go back here, they may tell us it's the one beginning. Let me see, on the 3rd day, they would recite the one beginning, a Psalm of Asaph. God stands in the divine assembly. Well, that's clearly what this Psalm is. God stands in the assembly. A Psalm for Asaph. God stands in the assembly. Okay, but where is anything to do with Sabbaton? Why are they saying this is read on the 3rd day? Why are they choosing this one and knowing this one is read on the 3rd day? Because they don't have the instructions we think we just saw in Psalm 48 and Psalm 24. There's no instruction here. Why are we doing that? That's perplexing to me. But we don't have any suggestion of a 3rd here or Sabbaton here. So why are we doing that? Perplexing. Let's move on to the next, and that is when we get to the 4th day, they would recite the psalm beginning, O Lord, and that is Psalm 94. Let's go find it. Okay, let's also remember this is the second offering that Ken gave me for what's happening here in the Old Testament. And we have a Psalm of David, and then here we've got 4th, the word for 4th, Sabbath. Again. So we once again have Sabbaton in the singular. So we have 4th Sabbath. Literally, it would be a Psalm of David, 4th Sabbath. That's what was literally penned. Now, I did find, I'm not going to take you through it, but I found times where 4th was utilized as in different gender. So this could be a feminine noun or adjective, but it also could be a neuter adjective. So we may not need to add day. In my understanding, my takeaway from what I've learned so far from Ken, we may not even need to add a day. But even let's just pretend, though, it continues to be a female, and so we would once again have the options of day 4th Sabbath. Would that make sense? What if we put day here? We have 4th for the 4th day Sabbath. Does that make sense if we try to retain the singular form of Sabbath? But if we said 4th Sabbath day, does that make sense? I think it makes sense. We don't need to change anything. So this really would be a Psalm of David for the 4th Sabbath day. Now, what would that suggest? 4th Sabbath day. 4th Sabbath. What? 4th Sabbath in the cycle of 52 Sabbaths, which would be in the first month? Maybe that's what they're saying. But I find it, once again, perplexing that this is here at all when we don't really see it. Because really, this one for the 4th and the one we had for 2nd are the only 2 where they've given us in the superscripts a 2nd and a 4th, ordinal numbers. They gave us Mia as 1, and it's being argued as it means first day of the week, but that's not how they gave it to us. They gave us as 1 Sabbath. Okay, so that I think that's more perplexing than anything else. But here we've got Sabbaton defined as a week again. Okay, let's go back to the Mishnah and see what they say for day 5. On the 5th day, they would recite the psalm, and then they give us Psalm 81. Let me go find it. Okay, so here's the psalm that they say needs to be read on the 5th day, and just to make sure it's the one, it is correct, because it says rejoice you in God our helper, and that's what the Mishnah says. It begins with, for the leader, sing for joy to God our strength, shout aloud to the God of Jacob, and that is rejoice you in God our helper, shout aloud to the God of Jacob. So this is clearly the psalm they're referencing. But we see no reference to an ordinal number of any kind again, just like Psalm 82. Why are they saying this needs to be read on the fifth day? I don't know. They don't get that instruction from the superscript. Again, we have no reference to either Sabbath or an ordinal number. So why are they doing it? That's perplexing to me. That's perplexing to me. Let's go to the sixth day. And on the sixth day, they would recite the psalm beginning, "The Lord reigns, he's robed," and that's Psalm 93. And let's go look at that. Okay, so here is Psalm 93. And here's the phrase in question. Here's the Greek, and that's rendered as "for the day before the Sabbath." Well, let's break this down. Here's Sabbath, and again, it's Sabbaton. Now, why there's no separation, I don't know, because this is the word for before. I think there probably should have been a separation here, because this is, if I remember right, it's the day before, or I'm sorry, this is the word for before, and here's the Greek word for day. So the day of, I guess, tone, I think that's tone. The day of the Sabbath, the day of, or the day before, maybe these two words together, before, but whatever this is, they're rendering it as the day before, Sabbatou being the singular again. Well, I don't really think that there's no question, the way they're rendering it, it all makes sense that this seems to be the literal rendering of it, the day before the Sabbath. Okay, so what would be the day before the Sabbath? That would be Friday, right? It'd be the fifth day. I'm sorry, it'd be sixth day, which is Friday. Well, okay. I think it's not perplexing what they mean. They mean the sixth day. They mean that day before the Sabbath. That's not perplexing. What would be perplexing to me is, why is it there? Why is this so? We're going to see only one, and the next one that I'm getting ready to show you is the only one where they are suggesting this kind of language for the Psalms. This is it. So we're not really questioning the rendition or the rendering here into English, and if anything's perplexing, again, I'm just saying it's, why is it here at all? Let's go to the last one, because then they go on to say, on Shabbat day, they would recite the psalm beginning as Psalm for Sabbath, which is Psalm 92, and let's go look at that. Okay, and here is Psalm 92 to be read on the Sabbath day, and that's how it's rendered here, for a psalm for the Sabbath day. Well, what are the Greek words that are being rendered into this? It's ti, hamera, ton, sabbatou. This is singular. So as Ken had already asserted up here, that we have this ti, hamera, ton, sabbaton, and I had said sometimes it's rendered in the singular. Well, here's the example of it being rendered in the singular, because we have ti, hamera, tu, sabbatou. That is being translated in English as the Sabbath day, but nobody really questions that. So we don't have sabbatou. There's no violence being done to sabbatou in this one, or in Psalm 93 that we were talking about. They have not changed Sabbath to week in either of these Psalms, but we know that they are talking about a specific day in context of the week, because this one is to be the Sabbath day and nobody's really questioning it. This one is to be read on the day before the Sabbath, and those are the only two that have really specific relation to before, to the Sabbath, as if you're talking about in the days before or after. The only two that have relationship to it. So I guess my point is, and then let me finish the thought, because when we go into Mishnah Talmud, do we have any? Well, he didn't offer it to me. I don't know how to go find it. Do we have any? First of all, they didn't tell us what specific week. They just said the first day of the week here. So they didn't say the first day of the week in the, in which week of the 52 weeks that this could be done. So literally, it just seems like every week, week after week, they would read this over and over and over again. These seven Psalms would be read over and over again amongst all of the 160 Psalms. And we have no rationale that I know of to why they would do the same thing over and over again and not move off to other Psalms in different weeks, in different months, etc. None of that's being offered. All that's being offered is that they gave us this idea of, days of the week. And I didn't have to question, and at this point, it isn't that I really want to become conspiratorial in nature. But if you have, because we know the Pharisees did this, but if you have an objective, if you are trying to support misinformation, wrong doctrine, then you can create things like this Mishnah Tamid, which is already born out of errant teaching and doctrines. You could create something like this to help support the idea that you're trying to find ways and times where we have Mia and Sabbaton, which is really Mia Sabbatou, being defined as week and first, and then part of the whole justification process being used in the new writing against the times that we have Mia and Sabbatou being translated into first day of the week in the new writings. So I've already shared what I think is perplexing, but not that we can get Mia Sabbatou. Actually, Mia Sabbaton, one Sabbaths, would be perplexing. One day, if he's going to stay with Sabbaton, which is plural, yeah, okay, that might also become perplexing then. But the word is Sabbatou, one Sabbath. And if you add day behind that, it's one Sabbath day, and it means the same thing. Not perplexing. It's only perplexing if you go to Sabbaton and you consider what I shared already. Okay, so here's my my reply to that second comment that Ken just offered. Well, it was going to be too big to try to write up, and that's what I say here. Hi, Ken. A pleasant surprise when I woke up this morning. More homework. Thanks. Your response is full of additional information and considerations that drive more questions for me. So I made another video in response to your input. And there's just too much to try to write up, but I question and I have questions. Thanks again, Ken. You are a scholar and a gentleman. Okay. So let me just say, when I made this reply and the second video, at that point in time, I had not fully evaluated this whole concept of what was going on with the superscriptions of the Psalms, and I was probably more troubled by that as a possible strong argument for what, against the idea of the Sabbath day, Timiaton Sabbaton, meaning on one of the Sabbaths. But I have since, as I have pulled it apart, I find that it to be less substantive as I had originally thought it when I made the video. Let me quickly share also, and this might be too small for you to see, but in the playlist that I made called Miaton Sabbaton, if you went to my site, I actually produced, I held them in private for a while, but this is the video that I made so that I could ask him questions and he could understand what I was trying to say. This is the first one I made in reply to his initial comment. This is the second one I made. It's called Miaton. They're both called Miaton Sabbaton Grammar and Idiomatic Considerations. The first one was labeled number 1 in response to his first reply. And then the second one I made is labeled number 2 in response to his second reply. And then just so you could see, he's going to make a reply to my second video here. And then I make a final reply to his comment, which that he did not reply to. So that ended our back and forth. But just so that you know where to go, it's in the playlist. If you're interested in this whole exchange and topic, it exists in my Miaton Sabbaton playlist, and under Miaton Sabbaton Grammar and Idiomatic Considerations number 1, 2, and number 3. But let me just say, if you go and watch those, what I'm sharing in this video would supersede my understandings that I had at the time that I was responding to Ken and making these videos. Okay, that gets us to Ken's third reply. Jim, thank you for your response. You are very kind and charitable in your comments. Unfortunately, I don't have time to do a full response at the moment. However, I'll toss a couple of items out and see if perhaps I can follow up more later, or if the conversation develops further. I don't disagree with your statement on the old writings and the new writings, though for convention, I'll continue using the Old Testament and New Testament. I hope you don't mind. Well, of course I don't mind, but what I was differentiating for him in the videos is that, where in our English translations we have an Old Testament and a New Testament, I consider them old writings and new writings because the old writings represent the scriptures that the writers of the new writings would have been operating from, and the new writings really continued that very same covenant They didn't change the covenant. They continued and expounded upon that, the understandings of the writings in the Old Covenant. So it just becomes old writings and new writings to me, and that's how I refer to them. And he's saying, okay, that's fine. In fact, he kind of agrees, or at least doesn't disagree, but he's going to continue to refer to his Old Testament and New Testament. And so that's what we're going to find throughout these, if there's any more references to them throughout this response here. But just a note on your intro, you make note of the fact that the chronology of the Sunday resurrection doesn't fit. So what I would have offered for him is my timeline. When I employ the Zadokian calendar timeline and the idea that Yahushua was keeping the Zadokian calendar as opposed to the calendar that was introduced via the Hellenistic priests and retained by the Maccabean priests, which would have been the Greek-based calendar with an evening-to-evening day and just different days that they're celebrating, whereas Yahushua clearly was keeping a different calendar. You can see it. It's evident when you realize what's happening. It's evident that he was keeping. I mean, he celebrated Passover a day before the Pharisees and mainstream Judaism did. Okay, so it just doesn't fit when you start adding the numbers and following that calendar. It doesn't fit. So he's he doesn't really argue with my chronology of timing. He doesn't really argue with it, but he does go on to say that the only passage that potentially notes a specific resurrection on the first day of the week is Mark 16:9, and I agree that is this passage. Now when Jesus, in the King James it reads, now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, but in Greek transliteration it's Anastas di proi proti Sabbatou, and this is the word. We don't see mia here. We see the actual literal word for first, Sabbatou, and this is the singular Sabbatou. So this is Sabbath. So this is proti Sabbatou. But when we get into proti, because I don't know that I'm going to develop it elsewhere, but proti is the literal word for first, but it's not just first. It can be used, and I'm not sure that particular form of it is used for first, but it can also mean foremost, chief, first thing, the most prominent thing, the very first thing that happens. And so I would say, and when you get into the lexicon, Strong's lexicon, when you actually just break down the meaningful words, we do have a but and now to rise first or chief, as in chief thing, the Sabbath. That's literally what the Greek is saying to us. So this would be like saying, having risen in the interlinear, having risen now, they're saying early the first day of the week, but I'm going to say it should be rendered, having risen now, first thing, chief, foremost thing on the Sabbath. So the very first thing that happened on the Sabbath is that Yahushua rose. And that's one of my arguments, and it is foundational to, well, I say foundational. It is, it's a very important passage, because he's going to share that all these other passages where we're talking about the resurrection week, but we're talking about the days that the women came. They came, and we're going to see this throughout. Well, basically, none of them are dealing with the actual rising of Yahushua, affirming that Yahushua was risen first thing on the Sabbath. And that stands juxtaposed to him rising just prior to the women. He's going to explain it. We'll let him do it. So, okay. So, just the only passage, let me just reread this again. The only passage that potentially notes a specific resurrection on the first day of the week is Mark 16:9. Well, he's saying that denotes it being on the first day of the week. I'm saying it denotes it being first thing on the Sabbath. But all the other passages do not directly address the timing of the resurrection, but rather, or instead, address the timing of the action of the women. Thus, those passages put a no later than boundary on the resurrection, but don't indicate exactly when the resurrection happened, potentially as early as the prior evening. Well, I'll just make some comments to this, because if you take Mark 16:9 as I have taken it, the proti, first, if you stay with the fact that we have Sabbath here, and that he rose first on the Sabbath, and you don't change this to week, and change this whole thing to first day of the week, which is what all of the English translations did. If you just say first thing, having risen first thing, You can say first Sabbath, but it would have to be like first thing to have it make sense. But if you stay with that idea, he rose on the Sabbath. And it would be the first thing on the Sabbath. And then if you stay with Sabbatou and Sabbaton, meaning the Sabbath, that's the same day that the women showed up. So they showed up early, but he had risen even earlier. So, and that's what I argue is that not only the timeline, but the meaning of the actual Greek that we read. First thing on the Sabbath, he rose, and then early on that same day, the women came. But let's go back to Ken's comment. He doesn't treat it as the Sabbath, though. He's saying the first day of the week. Because that's what all the English translations and his understanding of the rendering of Miaton Sabbaton would be. But he basically is saying that puts a no later day boundary on the resurrection. So if you were to try to stay with the women showed up on the first day of the week, and you want to stay with that, which is Sunday. They showed up on Sunday. Well, then you could still have Messiah rising on the Sabbath. And if you're keeping the Judaism calendar, the Greek calendar, to rise on the Sabbath would have had to happen by evening on the day before. Because what would be early on the sixth day? Early on the sixth day, maybe it could be as early as evening that night before. But if they really mean as the sun rises, as the passages seem to clear, it wouldn't really be early on the sixth day. It would be in the middle of the sixth day, but early in our normal days, which are all part of the arguments that I make with regard to the timing of the resurrection week. So, but still, no matter what, all you have to, if the women show up, all you need, if you don't have the passage dealing with the timing of the resurrection, all you know is that when they showed up, he was already risen. So, and I agree with that. And I would say that is getting employed by so many in the Torah community who are continuing to retain the idea of an evening to evening resurrection and counting a full, as if those 3 days and 3 nights have to be full exact 24-hour periods that had him rising at 3 p.m. or the 9th hour on the Sabbath. Then those folks who are having Yahushua rise late in the day on the Sabbath, like at 3 p.m. or the 9th hour, need this passage where all the passages where the women are showing up to be the first day of the week, because had they showed up on the Sabbath and he was already resurrected, well, he can't then also resurrect later in the day. All of those things are problematic. All of them are problematic and resolved by my understanding according to the Zadokian calendar and using their position of a day beginning with the sunrise, etc. Does all of that get fixed? Okay. All right. I do think that, let me just go on to say let me just start back up here. Thus, those passages put a no later than boundary on the resurrection, but don't indicate exactly when the resurrection happened, which is potentially as early as the prior evening, which would still land it on the Sabbath. I guess you have the breakdown. You either, if it's before the sun goes down, I guess it's Sabbath. And if it's at sundown, it would become first day of the week, according to everybody's understanding of this. But as I expect there is controversy surrounding the long ending of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. I have heard that. I haven't heard it recently, but I've heard it plenty in history. Throughout my 30 plus years in church doctrine, this isn't the first time that this was offered to me. But he goes on to say and repeat that, and that is that the oldest and most reliable manuscripts end at 16:8. And that he goes on to say, I believe that verses 9 through 20 are not original and were added later. Okay, so that's foundational to his belief. Well, I would challenge immediately. Maybe I would have just accepted years ago, but now I challenge. When you say oldest and most reliable manuscripts, what oldest and most reliable manuscripts are you saying? Because you can't just say that anyway. You just can't throw it out and have me just receive it. What are you talking about? Give me the manuscripts. Because really, are they the oldest? Are they the most reliable? Who deems them the oldest? And who deems them the most reliable? Because those are subjective statements that are always in argument in these various communities. So what are the oldest and most reliable manuscripts that end at 16:8? And if you are going to remove verses 9 through 20, then you remove any reference to when Yahushua was resurrected in all of Scripture, because 9 is it. That's where you get the idea that he was resurrected on either the Sabbath or on the first day of the week. But he says it's not, doesn't belong there. And if that's true, then he goes on to say, did Jesus really resurrect on Sunday? Because that's what he's saying. That 16:9 is suggesting that the resurrection happened on the first day of the week. So he's saying that if you get rid of that passage, did he really resurrect on Sunday? And he goes on to say, very possibly not. Again, the text don't specifically say when. So he's, all of the English translations are telling you Jesus resurrected on Sunday. I'm saying, and we do have some translations, Hallelujah Scriptures would be one of them, where we are seeing that he resurrects on the Sabbath day. But basically, I'll end it here. He's saying, did he really resurrect on Sunday? And he's pulling into question Mark 16:9. Well, I don't know that I can go along. I don't just embrace any of this. I would need more evidence that it doesn't belong than what I'm being given. But he does go on to say, because this is what I would have posed in my video to him, you question why Mark would say in chapter 16, verse 2, ti mieton Sabbaton, but in 16:9 would have used pro ti Sabbaton if they both meant, as we see in the English translations, because here, ti mieton Sabbaton, kai lien proi ti mieton Sabbaton. So early on one of the Sabbaths is being rendered in the King James as very early in the morning on the first day of the week. So ti mieton Sabbaton is being rendered as first day of the week. When we get to Mark 16:9, now we have anastas di proi pro ti Sabbatu also being rendered on the first day of the week. So pro ti Sabbatu is being rendered on the first day of the week. Why do we have two different ways of writing that? He says it wouldn't. That's what he says. My response is that he wouldn't. And the variance is in how is referred to early in the same chapter as well. And the variance in how it is referred to earlier in the same chapter as well as in the other Gospels is one of the numerous evidences that it is a later addition. Well, let me just finish commenting to that. We don't have in any of the other gospel accounts where we're addressing the rising of Yahushua. And if he doesn't accept this as first thing on the Sabbath, if he's already predisposed to change Sabbath to week and turn this into first day of the week, then this would, I could understand why he's saying this, but in Mark 16:9, Mark is conveying an entirely different meaning than he did in 16:2, because in 16:2 he literally mean very early on one of the Sabbaths. But when he gets to 16:9, he literally is trying to say Jesus was risen pro ti, first thing, foremost on Sabbath day. He's trying to communicate that. And if we remove this passage, this is the only reference we have to it. And only if we're trying to render this as first day of the week, as the vast majority of our English translations are doing to us, does this become perplexing and complicated. If you stay with foremost, he rose foremost on the Sabbath, and then all of these translations of ti mieton Sabbaton and their variations into the first day of the week, if they stay on the first day of the Sabbath, then what we have is Yahushua rising first thing, foremost on the Sabbath, to be followed up with visits from Mary and the other women very early on that same day. And another reference later when we get to John, because we have, again, more of these references, ti mieton Sabbaton, where they're talking about when they came. Here's John 20, chapter 20, verse 1, where we have first day of the week when Mary's coming, which is really, ti mieton Sabbaton, again, very early on one of the Sabbaths, or on one of the Sabbaths. But then we have in John 20 where we're referring to a little bit later in the day, and I will butcher this, I'll try it, but it's like uzis un opsius ti hemera ikin. So ikin ti mieton Sabbaton. So that's how that's rendered, but really they're trying to convey then the same day at evening. So they're basically saying here, if I am following all this okay, the same day, here it is, then the same day in the evening, that's what they're conveying here, at the same day of the evening, but then they take ti mieton Sabbaton to mean first day of the week, when it really means on the Sabbath. So if we are staying with pro ti Sabbatu, that he was risen, and ti mieton Sabbaton as the women coming early on one of the Sabbaths, and then we stay with the same day being the Sabbath, then we don't need to be translating ti mieton Sabbaton into the first day of the week. They are all referencing the same day, all referencing the Sabbath. All right, let's go back to his comment. Okay, so let's keep moving on. So it feels like a lot of your concern with reading Mia as first rather than one is that you perceive it to be fairly rare and primarily only in relation to these 9 instances in the New Testament. And he goes on to say, however, it isn't rare for it to be used as first in the broader corpus of Greek literature or the body of Greek literature, and I gave the example of Numbers 1:1, but there are numerous other that we see. Okay, so let me address this. In the new writings, literally, if we get into one in all of its versions, so here's the masculine form of one, Haste, the 3 feminine forms of one, Mia, and Mias, and then here's the 4 offered up as neuter and potentially masculine genders of one. We have Hin, Hinna, Hinni, Hinnos. Well, we have a total of 161 occurrences of the neuter form, or Hinni, Hin, Hinna, Hinnos, 79 times that the feminine form is used to denote one, and 99 times that the masculine form is used, for a total of 345 times. Well, having done the base work here, I'm going to say 100% of the time Haste is translated as one or some version of it. 100% of the time, all of the Hin, Hinna, Hinni, Hinnos are all translated as one or some version of it. When we get to Mias, and we have 79 versions, well, I'm going to say that 71 of them are one or some version of one. Only 6 times is Mia translated as first, and 2 times Mian is translated as first, for a total of 8 times altogether that we see Mia or Mian translated to first. And just to say, because he referenced it earlier, because when you take it in concert with Sabbaton or Sabbath, 5 times it's happened with the plural form of Sabbath, which is Sabbaton, and it didn't happen at all with the singular form of Sabbath, which was Sabbatou. But it did happen one time where neither was involved, and that is that Revelation 9:12 passage where we have, one woe has passed, that, he's saying, and that we've seen translated as first woe is past. But that's not universally done, because we see, let me just go there real quick, we see, as I said, we see the King James Version translating as one. The New King James, we have other literal translations where they are trying the more literal translations and not the paraphrased. I mean, I know NASB tries to be literal, but, when we get to the Berean literal and some of the other literals, they're still staying with one. Okay. And then we have Mian translated 2 times, 1 time alongside of Sabbaton, the plural, and 1 time along Sabbatou, the singular. But still, the point is, if you take 8 times that Mia or one is rendered as first in the new writings, against 345 times that one is communicated and the words are used in the passage, that's 2% of the time. When we get into the Septuagint, which is where he's headed, we do have more occurrences of it. But that also requires, it's still rare, because the vast majority of times, Mia and Haste and all, the vast majority of time that they were saying a word for one, it was intended to mean one or one of its variations. It is rare that we see anything else. And I will also say that it exclusively is used against some sort of noun of time, a temporal noun, such as week, such as a month, or one of those are the 2 big ones, such as week or such as month. And almost all of the ones he's getting ready to show me, the temporal noun would be month and not week. I would say one of the first things I saw when I went searching for one, and did some work on it. Well, right away in Genesis, we have day 1, that so many of the English translations are giving us as first day. But day 1 is day 1 of a week. So we are talking about a day within the temporal noun week. So I'm going to say that 100%, I'll say it now, that all of the examples he's getting ready to give us where one, Mia, is being translated as first, all of them do give us a temporal noun. They are all working with the temporal noun, and all of his examples are going to be working with the temporal noun month. So let's get into the example. So he gave us Numbers 1:1, and I won't repeat it because it's the same thing over and over again. Because here he gives us Genesis 8:13, Exodus 42. He gives us all of these passages, but let's get what's common throughout of it. It's this in the Greek and this in the transliterated Greek. Mia to minos, where we have a feminine adjective modifying a masculine noun for month. I'm pretty confident it's masculine. It may be neuter, but I think it's masculine. But whatever it is, we have gender misalignment. So we need a feminine day or noun to go along with it. So we're inserting day, and nobody questions it because the context makes it so evident. But then you have all these questions. Okay, so if you're going to insert day, where would you insert it? Do you insert it before Mia and you have day 1 of the month? Do you insert it after Mia, which would be 1 day of the month? Or do you insert it after Minos, which would be 1 of the month days? Well, 1 of the month days, I guess that could mean something similar to 1 day of the month, where basically you're just talking about you got all these days within a month, and we could be talking about broadly one of them, which he will express here in just a little bit also. So really, none of that makes sense, because really all of this is intended to mean, it becomes pretty clear in context that we're talking about day one of that month, which is the functional equivalence of first day of the month. So we can get there in English just fine. In fact, maybe we prefer saying, well, I know we prefer saying first day of the month to saying day 1 of the month, but it's still just as grammatically correct to say day 1 of the month to achieve the same meaning of first day of the month. And this or some variation of this is what is going to be offered over and over again. Mia in concert with day, because you must have day. I mean, it could be a different, depending upon what your temporal noun is, it could be a different unit. But in the context of months, we're talking about days again. So we're talking about day 1. And you have to have day 1 together with Mia to arrive at first. And you must have that temporal noun of the month. So over and over again, we have Mia to minos. And then this is also, and he's going to point this out, this is the Greek word for first. And, so there are times that we do get into ordinal use of one, but, you could ask why, because you could have said day 1 of month 1. You could have had day 1 of month 1. You could have said that, but that's not how they said it in the Greek. They said they had in the first month. Here's how they wrote it: in the first month, let me start again. In the first month, day 1 of the month. That's how it's literally written here. In the first month, day 1 of the month. Now that is awkward English, and it seems better for us in English to say the first month, in the first month, on the first day. Okay, and we can do that in English, but that's not what they wrote. In the first month, day 1 of the month. That's what they literally wrote. And then he goes on to say, note that first, protos, is used in relation to month, but Mia is used in relation to the omitted but implied day. And that's fine. And if we had just say day 1 of the month, that's easy. But if we're going to say first day, in the first month and then day 1 of the month, then it gets, or in month 1, day 1 of the month, that it becomes even more awkward English for us. But still, that's how they wrote it, and that's how they would render it. So then they go on to introduce Exodus 40:20, where now we've seen Hemera Mia to Minos to Protu no Mia. And here we have day 1 of the month. So here we don't even have to insert a day. They've given it to us. They did not create an ellipsis here. They gave us day. And this one is to be rendered Hemera Mia, day 1 of the month. Then it goes on to say Tau Protu Numenia. So on the first day, this is how it's being rendered in English, first day of the first month at the new moon. So first month. Okay, so we've rendered it first day of the first month, but literally it is on day 1 of the month of the first. The first month. On day 1, the first. And then they don't even say month. They just say, but here we've got Numenia, which they're calling the new month, which is a month. Okay. But the idea here is we still have the Mia being rendered as Mia all by itself is not being rendered as first. Hemera Mia is being rendered as first. It's not going to come up here, but I will say I did find when I went searching through the Septuagint that sometimes Hemera Mia is rendered as one day, not day one all the time, but one day. And why we still see Hemera in front of Mia when Mia would clearly, if that was the correct meaning, should be Mia Hemera. I don't know why they do that, but we're not really questioning that here, because where we did say one day, I never saw it translated as first. It was just one day. Okay, but then we see that played out over and over again. Here's the miatominos over and over again, that he's saying is being rendered as first day, and I'm saying, yeah, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. Over and over again, here's miatominos, which is here, miatominos. That was Ezra 7:9. Here's Ezra's 10:16, where we have Hemera and me with Mia again. Hemera Mia tu minos, but it's all the same thing. We're talking about day one of the month in question, over and over and over again. Hios Hemeras Mios tu minos. Well, okay, so we've introduced until here, until day one of the month. Okay, until the first day of the month, they're saying, but still it's the same concept. It's the day one of the first month. Here's Nehemiah, where we have Hemera Mia tu minos again. Here we've got it. It's all the same thing over and over again. And I did go look up all these passages, and it's pretty much all the same. It's all the same. And then there are other examples in secular Greek, I guess. As you can see, it isn't rare at all. And it frequently is used in relationship to temporal periods, and often with day omitted but implied, just as in the 9 passages in the New Testament. Okay, so let me here explain what I found as I went looking. It isn't just these temporal nouns associated with month. I did find some other times where Hemera and day were together, and we have them rendered as first, but always in context of some sort of temporal period. So I do agree that there are similar examples, that there are not similar. I'm going to say not similar because they're not similar. They are not the same thing that we see happening in the new writings, where we have one of these versions of Sabbath, because we have 3 different versions of plural, 3 different versions of singular Sabbaths, but the ones we see being converted to week are Sabbaton and Sabbatou. We do not see throughout the Septuagint, except for those superscripts in Psalms, we do not see Sabbaton and Sabbatou being rendered first into week. We don't see it happening. So they're not similar. They're not similar, as he's saying, because nobody has to change the minos around to something else, or another word into minos. It already existed. So they're not similar. That's the first thing that I would say. And let's say that's an unfair statement and cry foul. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Here we're similar examples in Greek, secular Greek. Okay, well, I will say that if he's saying there are similar examples, like where Hemera Mia was rendered as first in relationship to month or week or something like that, okay, I can agree with that, and it isn't rare at all. I would still say that the use of day one to mean first, the use of it is not rare, but it's not frequent in the old writings. But I will also say it makes sense for day one to be rendered first there because of the communication of day one. And he says in the temporal noun, and he says frequently it's used in relationship to temporal periods. But I'm going to say not frequently exclusively. I didn't see anything where I never saw an example. I couldn't find an example where I would see Mia, a version of Mia, translated all by itself without day, and I never saw it translated all by itself without day as first, and I never saw even day one translated as first day unless it was in relation to a temporal noun of week or month. I just didn't see it. And so, okay, so here's where I was saying similar examples, just as in the 9 passages in the New Testament. Here's where I say, no, I cry foul here, because it's not just as in the 9 passages in the New Testament, because the passages in the New Testament also involve changing Sabbath or Sabbaton into a temporal period first. So you had to go and do that. So they're not just the same. They're not just the same. They're not even similar, in my opinion. Okay, you posed the question if original readers would have idiomatically known that one of the second month meant the first day of the month. Well, yes, absolutely, and they did. Okay, so I think he didn't really represent this exact, because it would be like, Mia, I guess, because we missed month here, one day of the second month, because that's how it was worded. I'm sorry, one of the month, and then the second month. So I think he has left something out here, but idiomatically the real point is, when they wrote what they wrote, did the readers understand it to be the first day of the month? Well, he said yes, absolutely. Then he goes on to say, and they did, but part of the problem here is we have the burden to translate it into proper English. Well, okay, here I've got to, we're going to have to, when you say proper English, we're going to have to tread lightly here, because he says day one of the second month isn't how we commonly speak English. Well, that's true. We would more commonly say, in fact, that's what he says. Instead, okay, a couple things here. Instead, we idiomatically say first day of the second month. Okay. So while day one of the second month may not be how we commonly speak, it is still proper English. So this, if this is suggesting that day one of the second month is not proper English, then I say no, I cry foul. But if we want to say that it's not how we commonly speak English, I'll go along with that. And so that if we then want to say that day one or one of the second month, actually, I think again it's worded wrong here. But if we were going to try to communicate that, we would idiomatically say, meaning that would be the idiom, day one of the second month would be the idiom to mean the first day of the second month. Well, I would say maybe we're overusing idiom again, because day one of the second month has the exact same meaning of the first day of the second month. So we're not, the literal word, the intended meaning of the phrase is not something different than the literal meaning of the second of the phrase. And so the phrase is not an idiom according to the definitions of idioms. Now, there is a definition that suggests that you may have atypical grammar, and you might want to idiomatically refer to it as into proper grammar, maybe, but I don't think that's what he's asserting here. It may be what he's asserting here, but I think two things about this statement. To suggest this is not proper English is wrong. It may not be common English, but it's not proper English. And to say that it's idiomatically then translated or to be rendered as first day of the second month, I think is misusing the word idiom here. And anything else would generally sound odd. Okay. Sound odd? I don't think it sounds odd. It just isn't more common English. So maybe that's also a foul. It doesn't sound odd. Though if someone said day one of the second month, it would be understandable. And I would say that's not even terribly odd. We may not as commonly say it as first day of the month, but nobody, if you were reading scripture and read that, would you have any question or give it a second thought. And it would be understandable. However, in English, there's a vast difference between saying first day and one day. Of course, this is what I was saying. One day changes the meaning altogether. Day one doesn't, though. Day one would be equivalent to first day, whereas one day would not be equivalent to either day one or first day. I'd accept the translation of day one of the month, but not one day of the month. Agreed. Regardless of how we translate it, in the context of coined Greek, it is quite clear that it is common that mia, in relation to a time period, is idiomatically understood as first day. And I would say, let's just break this down just a little bit. It is quite clear that it is common that mia, in relationship to a time period, is idiomatically understood as first day. And I'm going to say no. Foul. I don't think that's fair. I think you must first have himer. You have to have day in here first before mia becomes first. And I don't think that to use this term idiomatic is even appropriate. Again, I just think we're overusing the term idiom. Okay. He goes on. You ask, why can't it be one of the Sabbath days? Well, I do ask that because mia ton sabbatu meras. Somebody's got to really explain to me why it can't be one of the Sabbath days, which retains the meaning on one of the Sabbaths. One of the Sabbath days is equivalent to on one of the Sabbaths. Well, here's his answer. Because there are other ways that would be expressed. If it was referring to a Sabbath day, i.e. not a specific one, excuse me, the commonly used idiom, ti hameriton Sabbaton, would almost positively have been used. Well, no, I just cry foul again. A couple things about that. First of all, if you were referring to a Sabbath day, ti hameriton Sabbaton was only used 4 times in the new writings, those 4 that he identified as far as I can tell. It was much more common to say something like tu Sabbatou or something else to communicate just a generalized Sabbath day without any apparent nuanced referring to try to order the Sabbath days and give something meaning. Just a broad reference to a Sabbath day. And so even though ti hameriton Sabbaton is a broad reference to the Sabbath day, it's not the only one. It's not even the most commonly used. So to say that it would have almost positively have been used is a foul. And to call, I say a foul. I just don't agree with it. I think it's unfair. I guess I am crying foul. And to call ti hameriton Sabbaton an idiom, why? It's just the day of the Sabbath. It's not an idiom. It means literally what it says it means. The intended understanding is to be exactly on one of the Sabbath days, on the day of the Sabbath. Okay. But that's what he offers, and he says that if you really meant to say the Sabbath day, you would have said it, ti hameriton Sabbaton. But again, there are other ways to say it. So you would, if you were going to use that rationale, the fact that you use tu Sabbatou and other things would render ti hameriton Sabbaton also unnecessary. It's the concept that you cannot make references using different phraseology to the same day. It's like saying in English that because you say the Sabbath, you can't say the Sabbath days, or that you can't say one of the Sabbaths. We can say it in all kinds of ways. To assert this, I think, is just wrong. Going back to my original comment on the older video, he's referencing my August of 2024 video, which is where he commented. So he's going back to his original comment to that video. If it were a specific Sabbath, well, okay, that's also a very limiting statement, because you can talk about a specific Sabbath without what he's getting ready to say. But he does give such as the first in the cycle of Sabbaths that was meant. So if it were a specific Sabbath that was meant, and that would be such as the first in a cycle of Sabbaths, it would have been expressed tu eviton Sabbaton. I'm sorry, here it is, tu heniton Sabbaton. No, okay, implying, let's go on to finish what he's saying, implying an omitted Sabbath rather than day to read the one or first Sabbath of the Sabbaths. So if it were a specific Sabbath that was meant, you would have expressed it this way. Well, what do I do with that comment? That can't be the only way you would have expressed it. First of all, if you're going to try to do, I don't know, we do see, a cycle of Sabbaths when we're going to differentiate, like the Sabbaths, when we start counting from, in before the day of Pentecost. We do have some uses where we're trying to do that, but generally speaking, where he says it would have been expressed, and if we were trying to say a specific Sabbath as though in the cycle of Sabbaths, it would have been this. Well, I don't see tu heniton Sabbaton anywhere. Nowhere can I find it in the new writings. Nowhere do I find it in the old writings. So I'm not even sure where it comes from. I mean, I know it seems like it ought to work, but I'm not sure where it comes from. And I'm not sure why he's saying if you were talking about a specific Sabbath, as though there's only one type of specific Sabbath you could be identifying, and this is positively how you would have expressed it. That just can't work. It's just not. It just can't. It just doesn't seem like a correct statement at all. And where he would get implied, first of all, if we have gender agreement, this is neuter and this is neuter. Why are we treating it as an ellipsis and supplying a word at all? And maybe it's not uncommon to go ahead and treat, even though you have gender agreement, go ahead and treat it as an ellipsis, even when you have gender agreement, and you would still have to supply a day. Maybe that's the case, But where does he get this idea of this whole phrase that's not being used anywhere, and that they would, imply an omitted Sabbath rather than day and create this, the first Sabbath of the Sabbaths? So the phrase literally means on one of the Sabbaths again, but he's saying that it would mean the first Sabbath of Sabbaths. Well, that's a journey to get there with a phrase that I can't find being used anywhere and an asserted ellipsis that involves Sabbath that I don't see found anywhere. But he goes on to say that that works in Acts 20, and then he rearranges a little bit to make this Sabbaths, because we've taken this Sabbaton in what he's getting ready to say. Well, let me finish what he says. It's more likely this, which he transliterates to tu hini tu Sabbath. So he's turned Sabbath into Sabbath to become the first Sabbath. But again, don't see this used anywhere. I don't see it used anywhere. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I would like to know where it is being used, but I didn't find it. So anyways, I think we're taking some liberties by moving this to singular again to come up with this. I just don't see this happening, and I don't see this as a solid argument. He goes on to say we see a parallel, and then he will draw it because there is a use of Sabbath. In fact, I'll show you. It's this word Sabbatah that is used one time, and it's used one time in the passage he's getting ready to say. Now, I think this word was used quite a bit in the Septuagint, I think. But when we get to his example of Acts 17:2, this is when Sabbatah is used, and then he gets into this. But none of this really is germane to our particular topic because it's talking about a different subject matter, and all of it makes sense. I mean, I'm not arguing with anything he says there. But again, it's not addressing the idea of the first Sabbath or something of that. There are other things that need to be nuanced. And then let's okay. Well, okay, let me just go ahead and finish this out. So why aren't they using hebdomah? Well, hebdomah is the transliteration for, it's the Greek transliteration for the Greek word for week. Why aren't they using week in the new writings? Because we don't see it in the new writings, but we do see it in the old writings. We see it commonly in the old writings. And we don't see, so they had the Greek word for week that is transliterated hebdomah, that they could, if they were trying to convey week, they could have used something involving that word rather than treating Sabbatu or Sabbaton, one of the words for Greek or for Sabbath, and changing it into a week. They have the word to do it. Why didn't they? Well, he says he can't answer, and I will say that I did do some work on this, and I find that in the new writings, they just refer to it differently. The concept of the week, they arrive at differently in a different way of counting. But they do have times when they are asserting a week without saying a week. But anyways, he goes on to say, however, I would argue that the complete absence of it strengthens the case for Sabbaton to be as meaning week, which means to translate Sabbaton as week. And he goes on to say, and it would be odd for a work this size and scope of the New Testament to not refer to any weeks or any days of the week other than the Sabbath day. Well, I just agree. I do think it's odd that we don't see hebdomah in the New Testament, but the idea that it is then justifying the also rare times where, we have Sabbath being translated into week when we have the word for week, it doesn't strengthen that case at all. In my opinion, I think it's weak. Let me go back up here before I do a quick summary and say that we do have nuanced meanings that we have to, that he's not referencing here that we might have. If we're just talking about any Sabbath and we don't need to be more specific than that, we could just say Tihameriton Sabbaton, Tihameritu Sabbatu. We could say tu Sabbatu. We could say all kinds of things just to quickly say, hey, don't come here on the Sabbath or something of that nature. But if we need to be more specific, as they needed to be during the resurrection week, then maybe they needed to use more specific phraseology. And because of the circumstances that the resurrection week provided, might also answer to why T Meaton Sabbaton is also rarely used and primarily used in relationship to that week. Because what happened in that week? First of all, we had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And what begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread? A Sabbath day, and that happens on the day after Passover. So we had Yahushua celebrating his Passover, and the next day, which would have been the first Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread for those who are observing the Zadokian calendar. And the following day after that would have been the day that the mainstream Yehudim, the mainstream Jews, were celebrating Passover and then also the start of the Sabbath the next day. But either way, we still have a midweek Sabbath that belongs to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, to be differentiated from the weekly Sabbath that is coming up in 4 days. And we see them trying to, because they do. In some of these passages, they say something along the lines of the Sabbath having passed and then on one of the Sabbaths. So what are they differentiating? The midweek Sabbath of the Moedim, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, contrasted against the weekly Sabbath that is coming up right behind it. When their reference, I think it probable that their reference to one of the Sabbaths means that these are the 52 weekly Sabbaths. So these are one of the Sabbaths. When you say one of the Sabbaths, you're identifying them as the same type of Sabbath, the same grouping of the Sabbaths that are the weekly seventh day celebration of the observance, of the Sabbath, contrasted against the midweek celebration of a Sabbath associated with a feast. So maybe that's the nuanced meaning when they use Meaton Sabbaton and say one of the Sabbaths. So let's just say they say following the Sabbaths on one of the weekly Sabbaths. So following the Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and on one of the weekly Sabbaths. What if that's the idea that they need to convey, and that's when they're using T Meaton Sabbaton? I think that very likely. Okay, in reply to that comment and his reply to my reply, I did reply one more time. Thank you, Ken. Once again, I really appreciate your engagement and knowledge. I have reviewed and pondered your comments. Of course, they lead to more questions, and so I've prepared a response. I tried to be succinct, but I think I failed, and this video is longer than intended. I'm sorry, but here it is. So then I offered him that. I guess there's more to read. Unless you are really fast, it appears you have you invest meaningful time in the subject and replies. I'm going back and forth in the manner we have been is somewhat time-consuming and disjointed. If you have information you still think I need or feel I'm missing significant points and would like to continue, I'm open to a Zoom meeting where we could better discuss. Let me know if that's of interest to you, and my email address is included in my site details if you'd like to email me to provide the address where a Zoom link could be sent. Thanks for everything, Ken. Okay. In response to that, I did not get a reply, and so that kind of ends it all. And so with that, let me just do a quick summary of where I'm at in all of this. So, T Meaton Sabbaton is a grammatically improper statement because of gender misalignment between the feminine adjective and neuter noun. It must be an ellipsis with a word omitted, and the missing word to be supplied is almost certainly the feminine noun hemera in the singular meaning day, or hemeras in the plural meaning days. Inserting this noun solves a gender alignment and corrects the grammar. So if we insert the noun, we no longer have gender alignment. So we just no longer have gender alignment. It may be an idiom, but I don't think so. Let me explain. Once the grammar is resolved, does the phrase become literal in meaning? Does it become literal in meaning, or is it an idiom with meaning other than the literal words? Because that's what an idiom requires. If the phrase literally means what it literally says, it's not an idiom. And just reviewing the definitions, and I won't read them here. Well, okay, quickly. The meaning of the word used must not be deducible from them. Or 2, the phrase cannot make literal sense unless it's understood to be a figurative expression. And 3, an idiomatic expression's meaning is different from the literal meanings of the words inside of it. And there are more definitions, but they all pretty much land you at, if the phrase literally means what it literally says, it's not an idiom. If it cannot mean what it literally says, and it has apparent meaning in context and culture, then it might be an idiom, like over the moon, or that's a hot potato. Just various examples, like Well, I won't keep trying to come up with examples. So let me rephrase it again. It's only an idiom if the phrase does not mean what it literally says, and there is a corresponding alternative meaning that would be known from context or idiom, and I would say within the culture where it's being offered. Maybe a phrase can be considered an idiom if the grammar is atypical and the understood meaning is more typical or customary grammar. And I'll give some deference to that, because if we're going to throw the term idiom around, I don't think we can do it because the literal meaning is not the literally what it says, but because the grammar might be atypical. And I would say, though, that rearranging the words and the grammar to accommodate common English would not qualify as an idiom. It just is simply translation into, and it's not literal translation, it's not word for word translation. It would be basically like a paraphrase translation where we're just trying to make the English more comfortable for our English speaking, for English speaking people in modernity. Okay, so let's keep moving. The use of the phrase T meaton Sabbaton appears to be rare. I find it only 7 occurrences of it and its derivatives in the new writings, and only 1 occurrence of its derivative in the Septuagint, for a sum total of 8 occurrences. I alluded to that as we were finishing up the responses. The use of T meaton Sabbaton, whatever it's intended to mean, which appears to be one of the Sabbath days, it's only used 8 times, and it seems to be used primarily in conjunction with that resurrection week. There is a use of it in Acts, where we are differentiating as on the first day of the week as they gathered to break bread, or however they worded it. Would they be trying to clarify that they were gathering weekly? That's their weekly gathering on the Sabbath. Would they be trying to clarify that versus because he had just referenced they had just been in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Paul had been trying to sail and make that. So were they intentionally trying to identify one of those weekly Sabbaths, one of the Sabbaths? When they say one of the Sabbaths, they're identifying that weekly Sabbath that occurs on the 7th day and trying to be clear versus just referencing any Sabbath, which could happen in the middle of the week if we're talking about one of the Sabbaths of the Moedim or feast. Okay, 8 occurrences in all of Scripture that I could find. Okay, so here are the options. Here are just some of the options I'm going to offer up as the way for handling the ellipsis. And then I'm going to try to employ them in this idea of how we arrive at first day of the week. First, we could place the missing singular noun hemera before mia. And the result would be something like T hemera miaton Sabbaton, which would be rendered as on day 1 of the Sabbaths. Okay, does that make sense? All by itself? No, it does not make sense. On day 1 of the Sabbath, where in context of the culture, there is no day 1 of the Sabbath, because all Sabbaths are 1 day in length. So it would make no sense as it stands. And in the solution, day 1 is ordinal, suggesting multiple days in an ordered sense, but we have a problem because we don't have multiple days in a Sabbath. And that makes the literal translation improbable because it requires the noun Sabbath to be temporal, a noun of time. But again, Sabbaths are only 1 day in length, so time would need to be broken into units smaller than a day. Only if Sabbaton is rendered as something longer than a day can this make sense. Hence, the rationale for translating Sabbaton as week solves this problem. So they take Sabbaths and make it a week. And now you have day 1 of a week, and it works. You've created the noun of time needed, the temporal noun needed for day 1 to work. And if there's already a predisposition to believe that the events in question happened on Sunday and had to happen on Sunday, it becomes expedient because the translated phrase then becomes on day 1 of the week, which is the equivalence of first day of the week. And I would say this would have been my understanding before spending some time with Ken's comments, that I think that they would have employed and how they would have handled this passage, this phrase, because they just needed it to be day 1. So they turned Sabbath into weeks. And where they've inserted day, now I understand why they inserted day. They have to insert day. But even so, it still doesn't rationalize why they are turning, doesn't give, other than the need to make it day 1, It doesn't give cause or justification for translating Sabbaths into weeks. And so without better cause and reason, translating Sabbaton into weeks seems, it just seems unjustifiable unless the phrase is considered an idiom. And here's where we start throwing out the word idiom, because now we say on day one of the Sabbath would be an idiom. When you spoke it in the days and you said day one of the Sabbath, you would just understand it to mean first day of the week. I don't think so. I think that's a stretch, but this was what I thought and what I would have believed would be the primary way that translators were getting to first day of the week. So here's the second option that I've offered, and it's place the missing singular noun hemera after mia. And the result would be something like ti mia hemeraton sabbaton, which would be rendered as on one day of the Sabbath. All by itself, can that make sense? Can it make sense on one day of the Sabbath? Well, maybe, because, there are 52 Sabbaths. And on one day of them, maybe. But it does seem awkward. But here, one would remain cardinal. One day suggests multiple days, but it doesn't have to be in an ordered sense. Could be any one day of the Sabbath. In fact, it suggests any one day of the Sabbath, any of the 52. But it also seems to have a literal meaning. I don't know why we would call it an idiom, unless we want to call the language awkward or atypical grammar, at least in English. And it would be an idiom only if it meant something other than a Sabbath day. So if it meant one day of the Sabbath, it's not an idiom. It's just awkward language. And so it could possibly be an idiom in the sense that the grammar is atypical and the intended meaning is typical grammar. And so where you said on one day of the Sabbath, it would have just been more typically, I think, should have been one of the Sabbaths. One of the Sabbaths. The Sabbath day. Something like that. Where they're trying to turn it into more typical grammar. Okay, so here's another option. You can assume two omitted words. You can insert another definite article and the missing feminine plural noun hemeras after mia, and the result would be something like ti mia tis hemeras ton sabbaton, to be rendered as on one of the days of the Sabbath. And in that situation, and in that sense, one would remain cardinal. One of the days again suggests one of multiple days without being ordinal. So it's just one of the days of the Sabbath. And it has a literal meaning. It doesn't have to be an idiom. Wouldn't necessarily be an idiom. But it does seem awkward and a mouthful and atypical grammar. So here I go on to say it would be an idiom only if it meant something other than a Sabbath day. If they literally meant on one of the days of the Sabbath, which would be a way for them to communicate one of the weekly Sabbaths, just like up here, one day of the Sabbath would be a way for them to communicate weekly Sabbaths. It would only be an idiom if they mean something other than one of those Sabbath days. That's when it would become an idiom, or possibly, again, in the sense that it's atypical grammar and, it's an idiom then for typical grammar, which I think is pushing it, but I'm putting it in here out of deference and trying to be fair. Okay, so option 4, though, is to place the missing word hemera after mia and treat the plural noun sabbaton as a singular noun. I really meant to put Place the missing word hemera. Yeah, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Let me keep going there. Place the missing word hemera after mia and treat the plural noun sabbaton as though it were singular. Okay, so the result would be something like ti mia hemeraton sabbaton, which would be literally translated as on one day of the Sabbath, which all by itself is just suggestive. Really, that is exactly what we were offering up here, option 2. And that would just literally mean on one of the Sabbath days. But what if it's to be understood or even rendered as on one day of the Sabbath? So turning sabbaton, and then this would be, and I will just say right here that I believe this is what Ken employs. I think this is where he gets to just the justification on first day of the week. Because he's made the argument that sometimes when we use sabbaton, they don't mean sabbaton, they mean Sabbath. This is plural, but what they really mean is Sabbath. And he made a broad brush justification of it, as we saw in the second comment where he said, sometimes, they just translate Sabbath, but really they meant Sabbath. That's the suggested intent that I think he was pushing at us. So then basically having placed hemera after mia, we have one day of the Sabbath. But if you understand it to be, or then even render it, like translate it in some of your passages and some of your scriptures as one day of the Sabbath, which we don't see them doing because they actually go the next step. But still, that's what you would need to do, is render it or understand it to be one day of the Sabbath. Well, if you change it to one day of the Sabbath and treat the Sabbath as singular, okay, all by itself, that would at first blush not make sense unless you start employing what Ken offered to us. That one day of the Sabbath would be meaning one day from the Sabbath, the day after the Sabbath. That stating one day of the Sabbath was how they would have stated, if they meant the day after the Sabbath, this is how they would have spoken it with that intent. I think it's a stretch, but that's, I think, how they are arriving at it. Here, one would remain cardinal, but since Sabbath is to be considered singular, one day cannot mean or reflect a multiples of days. Instead, one day of, here, one day of, is to be understood as a measurement of time and is synonymous with one day from and one day after. So this is where they're saying, basically they're turning this into one day of the Sabbath to mean one day from or one day after. Now that, if you're going to take, if that can really mean what they're suggesting that it means, then it really would have literal meaning. It might be awkward, but it has literal meaning of meaning one day of, or one day from, or one day after the Sabbath. So it's literal. But it also has the functional equivalence to the first day of the week. Because the one day of the Sabbath, one day after the Sabbath, would be day one, the first day, the functional equivalence of the week. And it would be, in this sense, it would be an idiom only if one day of is not the equivalent to one day from or one day after, in the Greek language and in cultural context. So this would really need to be an understood thing within Greek language and an understood thing in cultural context, that you would say one day of when you're meaning the day after. Now, I will say, as I showed you in the Septuagint, they had ways to literally say the day after the Sabbath. They didn't need this one day of the Sabbath. And other than this, how ti mia ton Sabbaton might be being rendered here and justified here, beyond that, I see no other evidence of one day of the Sabbath being used anywhere in the Septuagint or anything else. So it is dependent upon that being usage in the Greek language and understood in cultural context for one day of to mean one day from or one day after. And it would only be an idiom if that's not what it meant. Or if its intended meaning then would be something other than the day after the Sabbath, which is not what they're arguing here. And I suppose you could go on and once again state that, it could be an idiom in the sense that the grammar is atypical and the intended meaning is typical grammar. So when they're saying one day of the Sabbath, it's an idiom for the first day of the week because the first day of the week is much better grammar when instead of one day of the week, I suppose. But that's an awful lot of explanation, an awful lot of trying to work it through. And here's option 5. Place the missing plural noun hemeros, or days, after the singular noun for Sabbath, which retains plurality and is the equivalence of Sabbaton. The result would be something like ti mia tu Sabbaton hemeros, to be rendered as on one of the Sabbath days. Well, one remains cardinal. There's no need to turn it into an ordinal first. And the meaning is literal. It means exactly on one of the Sabbath days or on one of the Sabbaton, one of the Sabbaton. And it would not be an idiom unless it means something other than one of the Sabbaths or Sabbath days. And this is what Ken is asserting, that it does mean something other than one of the Sabbath days, because he says that incorrect grammar makes it not doable, not workable. It cannot be the meaning because it's improper grammar, and that's taking it a step too far. Okay, let me just summarize a couple quick things. I would say that your doctrinal bias will influence how you can receive what I'm saying and how you will receive what Ken would be offering. If you embrace the church teaching that's reflected in the most English Bible translations, that the resurrection of Christ occurred on Sunday, and or Mary's visit to the tomb was early on the first day of the week, which was Sunday, and that it's legitimate to observe the Sabbath day on the first day of the week or Sunday, which is now considered the Lord's Day, then you're going to accept either option 1 or 2 as your possible solutions, and you're going to reject the other options. But if you embrace what I have come to believe about the resurrection week and the handling of the all of these, okay. If you embrace, I'll just read what I said. If you embrace that Messiah's resurrection occurred on the third day, which is the Sabbath, according to the Zadok calendar observed by Messiah, and if you're going to embrace that Mary's visit to the tomb was early on the weekly Sabbath day, and that observance of Saturday remains on, the observance of Sabbath remains on the seventh day of the week as practiced according to Torah, then you're only going to receive options 2, 3, and 5 as possible solutions, and you're going to reject the other 2. And I would say 5 is the obvious winner by a landslide, in my opinion. Let me just quickly outline what I think is the summary of Ken's both express and inferred positions. It's my opinion that Ken clearly accepts on the first day of the week as the writer's intended meaning when he penned that phrase, Ti miaton Sabbaton. And I think that he embraces not option 1, but embraces option 2, that solving the phrase's ellipsis is served by placing day after 1 and changing the word Sabbaths to Sabbath, which arrives us at one day of the Sabbath, which he asserts means the day after the Sabbath, and would have been the way to communicate that, rather than some of the other ways that we see in the Septuagint, where they literally had a phraseology and words for the day after Sabbath. But all of this is functionally equivalent to the first day of the week, and hence his agreement with the English translations. He asserts that Ti miaton Sabbaton cannot literally mean what it literally says because of grammar, and so the writer's intended meaning had to be something other than the Sabbath day. And he does this by, some of the ways, first of all, he just straight asserted it, but he also asserts it that because if you really meant on one of the Sabbaths, which would be the Sabbath day, for it to be literal and the intended meaning, well, you should have penned Tu heniton Sabbaton. But we see no examples of Tu heniton Sabbaton anywhere, so I don't know how and why he's arriving at that. But still, that's what he's saying. If you were going to mean one of the Sabbaths, you would have penned it with correct grammar. But then he goes on to say that okay, let me continue with that. It penned it in correct grammar, which then word for word translation becomes the neuter adjective heni, now modifying the neuter noun Sabbath and forming correct grammar, which would literally be on one of the Sabbaths without problems to mean the Sabbath days. And he's saying that's what it's meaning. But then he goes on to say, but if you really penned that, you would be saying something else. And he asserts that the phrase Tu heniton Sabbaton would be an ellipse. And why he didn't establish, at least not for me, with the assumed missing word to be Sabbath, so then the intended meaning would be something like Tu heni Sabbatou, ton Sabbaton, or on one Sabbath of the Sabbaths, and then he shortens it to Tu heni tu Sabbatou, which would be the first Sabbath. So he takes a phrase that seems to be correct in grammar, but isn't used, and translated it into by adding another ellipsis in Sabbath, he's translated it into this idea that it is trying to be specific, that we're talking about a particular Sabbath within a cycle of Sabbath. But I see no evidences of that anywhere. All right. So he explains that the intended meaning of the phrase, all right, that's what this is. I'll just go ahead and finish reading it. He explains that the intended meaning of this phrase is to be the use of heni as ordinal in the sense of a cycle of Sabbaths, which I think he means to be the weekly Sabbaths. He provides the cardinal number heni for 1, which then I guess suggests heni can also be used to be translated as first, but we didn't see it happen anywhere in the new writings. And I don't think I saw it even in the Septuagint. By inference, then, you would suggest that you would have cardinal numbers 2 through 52 that could also be translated as ordinal numbers for the rest of the cycle, and that we would see some sort of reference to those. While at first blush, correcting the adjective to match Sabbath seems logical to convey the literal meaning on one of the Sabbaths, I can find no such use of the phrase in either the New Writings or the Septuagint, which is what I've been saying. So for whatever reason, it does not appear to have been used in any sense inside these writings, either of them, New Writings, the Old Writings, or the Septuagint writings, neither as one of the Sabbaths nor as first Sabbath of the Sabbath. So I find no uses of heni as first in the New Writings or in the Septuagint, and I can find no uses of heni combined with any form of Sabbath in the New Writings or the Septuagint. If the phrase exists and can be used in any sense, it does not seem to be validated in either of the writings. And then he goes on to assert and reject that on one of the Sabbath days can be the literal meaning. On one of the Sabbath days. Why? Because the correct handling of this ellipsis, as its literal meaning and the correct handling of the ellipsis. And why? Because he argues that there are other ways to express this. But he doesn't, as I mentioned in the video, other ways to express it. I'll just stay with that. To express and convey the idea of one of the Sabbath days, if that were the writer's intent. He asserts that he would have used the common idiom ti hameriton Sabbaton on the day of Sabbath, which is the shortened Hebrew biom hasabat on the Sabbath day. And by inference, he precludes additional ways to express the Sabbath day. Because there are other ways to express the Sabbath day other than ti hameriton Sabbaton. In fact, we have more commonly used phraseology to express the Sabbath day. And he does not allow for the need to have express nuanced meanings, such as differentiating the weekly Sabbaths from the midweek Sabbaths of the Moedim. Okay, and then let's get to my summary statement. And I'll just read my summary statement. I continue to find that the preponderance of evidence suggests in each of the occurrences where ti meiton Sabbaton was penned that the writer's intention was to communicate that the events happened on the weekly seventh-day Sabbath. Specifically, the one following the first Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that was observed earlier in that same week. Ti meiton Sabbaton seems to unquestionably be an ellipsis leading to apparent improper grammar, and was intentionally used by at least 4 writers. So it must have been acceptable and understandable in the Greek language and in the culture of the times. When the feminine noun days is supplied as the missing word, both the ellipsis and the grammar are fixed. Supplying days behind Sabbath turns the phrase into on one of the Sabbath days, which is option 5, and seems to be the simplest and most rational solution. And it continues to convey the same meaning without the need to treat it as an idiom for meaning something other than its apparent express meaning. It also correctly reflects the context of its use within the crucifixion week and the cultural context of observing Sabbath on the 7th day according to Torah. It's just harmonious. Admittedly, in English, we do not share the same problem with gender alignment, but the phraseology seems similar to how we might say either on one of the Sabbath days or on one of the Sabbaths to convey a similar meaning. The fact that we can and do convey it in one way does not preclude the option to convey it in another way, especially when circumstance suggests a need to nuance or differentiate the meaning. Similarly, ti meiton Sabbaton could have nuanced meaning among the options for expressing the Sabbath day, such as intending to differentiate between the weekly 7th-day Sabbath and the non-weekly Sabbaths. Evidence offered in support of translating as first day of the week appears to be scant and weak in my opinion, and it does not withstand scrutiny. That's my conclusion. It just does not withstand scrutiny when I really go looking into the evidences provided. I find insufficient justification for translating the expressly written word Sabbath to mean week, which is the prerequisite required to turn the definition of one into first. It's rarely done and questionable when it is. It appears that the single biggest motivation for doing so is the need to support and preserve the church doctrines created in the early centuries that led to the celebration of Easter Sunday as the resurrection day of Messiah and Sunday as the Lord's Day. Various translations throughout history have been influenced by this church doctrine and in turn then reflect and support these doctrines. So in summary, I find many good reasons to continue understanding ti meiton Sabbaton to mean literally on one of the Sabbath days, meaning on the 7th-day Sabbath following the previous midweek Sabbath of the feast, and I find no meaningful justification to treat it as an idiom for the first day of the week. All right. Well, that concludes. If you've stayed with me this long, then you must really be interested in the topic of meiton Sabbaton as I am. And so I thank you. And may you be Baruch, and take care.